I take it everyone in the room can see and hear me now that the microphones are working loud and clear? Good. And I understand that the YouTube live stream is now working, and presumably everyone on that can now see and hear me. Thank you. Good. For those of you out there that are viewing, there has been a bit of a technical hitch that's resulted in a slight delay to resuming the inquiry, but don't worry, you haven't missed anything, or nothing exciting anyway. Right, usual reminders, mobile phones, laptops and smartwatches switched off or to silent, please. There's no fire alarm test due today, so if it sounds the fire exit is out the way we came in. Last week I heard statements from interested parties and the Council's evidence on master planning and viability. I also visited the site, which involved a 7-kilometre walk around the lanes and footpaths and the surrounding areas, including the bridges at Coot Lane. If after hearing the evidence I need to visit the site again, I shall do. Today I'll start to hear the Council's evidence on transport matters from Mr Stevens, which is currently anticipated to continue into tomorrow, but we need to go through some procedural matters first. I have been advised that Councillor Foster, the leader of the Council, has indicated that he wishes to speak to the inquiry, and this is likely to be at some point tomorrow that he's available. And so it's been suggested that that be slotted in between Mr Stevens and Mr Wood. Everyone content with that? Good. Yeah, good. Thank you. There was also a flurry of documents submitted over the end of last week, including the Transport Statement of Common Ground, so thank you very much for that. There were a couple of new drawings within that I just wanted to get a bit of clarification on, because the proposed site access arrangement appears to have changed, but I'm not sure how much that has changed, or whether any parties would have been affected by that at all.
Would you like Mr Axon, if he's aware of, is this coming as news to us?
Did you say as part of the Statement of Common Ground?
Yes, yeah, yep. Well, it arrived in the same bundle email, and it's a revision of one of the drawings that would have been part of proposed condition 2.
Perplexed because we're not aware of having suggested any changes to
No, and I'm not aware of any drawings amending or indeed doing anything with the access as far as the Statement of Common Ground is concerned.
Right.
Okay. We better just check what was sent to you.
Yep,
So I think was it from us or from the appellant?
Bear with me, I'll just open up my emails.
You sent it.
I sent it.
What have you been attaching to the email? Okay. Mike, they all came from you apparently. So what are these drawings?
Yes, sorry sir, I'm just conferring.
Okay. Problem. So from what I can tell, there were 2 drawings. There was a site access arrangement drawing and a spine road land plan, as well as the CBLR movement corridor criteria.
Yes.
Yes, sorry sir, I wasn't. The site access plan hasn't changed since November 2021. So there should be nothing new in the Statement of Common Ground that effectively changes.
So is this drawing has a different number to the one that has been previously identified as being the plan that we should be considering?
What we'll do is we'll just check the drawing numbers.
Okay.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Hopefully Mr Stevens won't disagree with this. There's nothing that we need to draw to your attention about any changes.
Okay, good. So you,
yep. Maybe this is just a drawing number issue.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
So can I just note, I've just pulled up the core document list as it currently stands. Transport Statement of Common Ground is CD 10.81. There are 3 other documents that have been added.
Yep.
CD 10.80, Spine Road Land, which I think you mentioned. CBLR movement corridor criteria 1082 and 1083 proposed site access arrangement with a drawing number. So leave that with us and we'll try and understand between the parties what those are all about and let you know.
Sounds like two of them are something to do with the 106.
They
I
are.
thought. But anyway. Okay.
Okay.
But I've noted where they are. If you could leave it with us, and
Sure, that's fine,
try
as
and-
long as it's not going to affect anything else this afternoon. Okay. There were a number of other emails that were floating around as well, but they just appeared to be sort of like ongoing discussion between the parties that presumably we don't need to discuss. Here
Yes, I wasn't
today.
aware that you would have been copied in on ongoing
Okay.
discussions, but I mean there are discussions about the Section 106 about conditions,
Yeah.
doing and fraying on the air quality payment. So yeah,
Okay, I haven't
Ignore
seen any of
all of those.
any of those, but right, okay. So within that bundle of stuff, there's nothing that anyone is particularly wanting to raise at the moment. We can
Well,
come
no,
back
I mean,
to
apart
it
from
later if
mystification
necessary.
on both our parts, I think. So we're, as my own friend said, we're take this away and
Okay.
I'll work out what's
Right,
going on.
Thank you. Right, thank you. Okay, in terms of updates then on some of the matters that we were discussing last week, there's three things: the building heights parameters plan, the planning obligation, and the conditions. Did you want to
on the building
start?
heights? Did we ever receive a plan back from the council? Was it? Right. Emailed exchanges there, but we haven't got to a final position on that. So it's
No
in
update
hand.
then.
I don't know whether it'll ever
Okay.
get resolved. But anyway, so there you are. That's that one.
Okay.
Section 106, I shall hand over to Mr. Lloyd.
Yes, so there was a meeting last Thursday between the solicitors, and an updated draft has been sent back to the council, so it's in progress.
Thank you.
I've nothing
Nothing
to add
to
on that. So
Okay.
it, as Mr. Lloyd says, it's in progress.
Thank you. And the conditions?
Conditions, Craig? Oh, hold on. Right.
Okay.
So
Right.
again, I think there's an ongoing exchange. I believe the last stage in that ongoing exchange was some suggested amendments today, this morning, which we're to respond to. So I think that's from Mr. Alsbury. It's with us. Progress is being made.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other interested parties that weren't present last week that wish to speak today at all? Nope. Okay, thank you. Any other procedural matters from either side?
Well, only, sir, that we had that conversation last week, didn't we, about time after the inquiry finishes on Friday of next week for us to sort out the counterparts, if I've got
Oh,
that
yes.
terminology
Yes.
correct.
Mhm.
We're going to try and get one doc. Oh, it's moving too fast for me. So what are you up to now, Mr. Lloyd? What's going on?
I think you would have preferred there to be one document, and we're trying to work to that.
Okay.
So that's the
Even
plan.
better.
So,
Okay.
So as soon as we have a document that's agreed or in the final form, we will then press the button to get that moved around.
Okay.
So I think in terms of timescales, so you mentioned possibly 2 weeks. So
Yep.
with the numbers, I just wonder whether we could aim for 2 weeks, but potentially have 3 just in case.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I see no particular problem with that
Thank you, sir.
if it's needed. Okay, thank you. Right. If there's nothing else, we will continue with the council's evidence then, moving to transport matters, and welcome Mr. Stevens for Lancashire County Council. You've had the opportunity to make yourself comfortable there. You've got
Yes,
all your
thank you.
papers. Good.
Yep.
Right, excellent. Thank you. Right.
Thanks,
Mr. Punter.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stevens, good afternoon. You should have with you your main proof of evidence together with its appendices.
That's correct.
And you produced a rebuttal proof as well.
That's correct.
You have that. We'll be needing from time to time some other documents, in particular the transport assessment produced in support of the appeal scheme, so that's CD 1.68. And we're probably going to be having a look at Mr. Axon's rebuttal proof as well as we go through things. So I hope you have those documents.
Yes, I have. Thank you.
And we might have reference to one or two others along the way, but let's see how we go. Let's introduce you to the inquiry first, please. We can do that from your main proof, page 4, section 1. You give your qualifications at paragraph 1.1, is that correct?
That is correct. I have an honours in civil engineering and a Masters of Science in Transport Planning.
Thank you very much. And your current role with the local highway authority, who is the county council, is as strategic highways planning manager within the Highways Development Control Department.
Correct.
Is that right?
That's correct.
And you've over 25 years experience in transport planning. How much of that has been at Lancashire County Council?
All of that time.
In terms of your familiarity with the appeal proposals, we know, of course, that the local highway authority provided consultation responses in respect of the planning applications back in September and October of last year. Is that right?
That is correct.
We needn't turn those up. They're in the core documents. Did you author those consultation responses?
That is correct. I had a personal involvement. I've had a personal involvement in the site for many years.
When did your personal involvement in the site start, roughly?
Approximately 5 years ago.
There were, of course, some planning applications made by these appellants back in 2019. One for the development of 1,100 up to 1,100 houses, the other for a stretch of the cross-borough link road between Penwortham Way and Leyland Road. You recall that?
Yes.
Were you engaged on behalf of the County Council in responding to those planning applications?
I was personally involved in those applications which relate to development, yes.
Okay. Just remind us, who were the highways engineers on behalf of the appellants for the purposes of those two planning applications?
Croft Consulting.
And we don't need to go into detail at this point, but in terms of the degree of agreement you reached with regard to the parameters for assessing the impact of those schemes, and in particular in mind the up to 1,100 dwelling scheme, what progress had you made with Croft?
We made good progress. We accepted the data that was collected for that application. We agreed the trip rates for the development. We hadn't yet got to the point of agreeing the distribution. We agreed the census data. We supported their approach to the transport assessment using a number of figures. It's the same figures which I have used in my proof of evidence.
We're going to come to
it's one of consistency.
We're going to come to trip generation specifically in due course. Now these appeal schemes were the subject of planning applications that were made in August last year, you'll know. When did you become aware of these proposals?
This proposal was probably just before it was submitted. I had a meeting with Mr. Axon, who wanted to introduce himself to the scheme. And that correspondence is also in my proof of evidence as an appendix.
Yeah, I think we can just note for the inspector's note where that appears. So within your appendices, Appendix 4, you tell us about your by reference to an email, by reference to the start of your involvement in this. It's an email from Mr. Whitaker, I think is one of Mr. Axon's colleagues, to you towards the end of June. Is that right? Inviting you to
Yes.
have an initial chat about the proposals with him.
Yes, that was on the 24th, and I believe the meeting was held on the 7th of July.
And of course, the
12th of July.
Yeah, the transport assessment we know in this case was produced in July.
Mm-hmm.
How far had you got with discussing the detailed parameters of the assessment with Mr. Axon or any of his colleagues between the 24th of June and the time when the transport assessment was produced in July?
Well, since the meeting took place on the 12th of July, it was one of a very simple introduction.
All right, we're going to come to some of the detail of that transport assessment exercise in a moment or two. Just before we do that, I want to deal with some broader points of approach. Now, the appellant's evidence, you'll be aware, Mr. Stevens, suggests that there's a fundamental difference between your approach and theirs, whereby they contend that the county council assesses schemes according to an out-of-date method, often referred to as predict and provide, whereas their approach, referred to as vision and validate, is one that is up-to-date and accords with up-to-date policy. That's the way the broad position of the parties is characterised. Do you accept that portrayal of your respective positions as a matter of generality?
No. The Highway Authority considers development for their merit. We consider what is required to make a scheme sustainable. I think what is also important in the approach that we take in Lancashire, which is very similar to all the other highway authorities, is about increasing personal choice to support sustainable transport and supporting more of an integrated transport system rather than something which was defined as predict and provide, which I believe was abandoned in 1998.
When you assess any development proposals, do you have regard to what's said about assessment of traffic impacts and transport impacts in the framework?
Well, in the framework it's fairly clear.
Do you have regard to the framework when you do your job?
Absolutely. All decisions are made having regard to that document.
Right. Can we have a look at it for a moment? There's a couple of paragraphs I want to draw to your attention. Starting on page 31, there's a heading towards the bottom of that page, considering development proposals. Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
Just ahead of paragraph 110. Just cast your eye down to paragraph 112, where it tells the reader what applications for development should do, and included at A, giving priority first to pedestrian and cycle movements both within the scheme and within neighbouring areas, and second, so far as possible, facilitating access to high quality public transport. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, in your assessment of these schemes, along with any other schemes, how important is it, in your view, that they meet the terms of subparagraph A?
That's absolutely critical. If we're unable to satisfy subparagraph A, we have a development that cannot be considered supporting a sustainable development.
We're going to come back to whether or not those aims are achieved in this case. Just cast your eye up to paragraph 110. It tells us that in assessing sites that may be allocated or specific applications for development, the following should be ensured, and then there are 4 sub-paragraphs. Do you see those?
Yes, I do.
To what extent have you sought to apply those in your assessment of these schemes?
Fully consider all those 4 points, whether that is within the site or whether it's beyond the site.
Okay. Now, the last of those points, D, one of the things to be ensured when you are assessing an application for development is that any significant impacts from the development on the transport network in terms of capacity and congestion or on highway safety can be cost effectively mitigated to an acceptable degree. Do you see that?
I certainly do.
Have you considered, again as a matter of generality, we're going to get to the nuts and bolts in a minute, have you considered the likely impact of the appeal schemes on the network in terms of capacity and congestion?
Yes, I have. I've looked at the very specific locations where the network is least reliable, i.e. at junctions, because I think what is important from my perspective, representing the Highway Authority, is about delivering growth without degrading the performance of the network.
Let's turn up the transport assessment, please, to understand where your approach and Mr. Axon's approach differ in terms of undertaking that assessment of effect. So CD 1.68.
Thank you.
You got that?
Yes, I have. Thank you.
And let's start with its conclusion and then we'll work backwards. It concludes, page 67,
Thank you. Let me just check. See if
which might be different in the PDF version, I don't know. Usually Miss Bell tells me that I'm wrong at this point.
Yeah.
Page 73, I think.
It's way out, isn't it? Yeah, just bear with me.
It's the summary and conclusions, section 8.
So that is on 73, I think, as the inspector was saying.
PDF 73.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have you got that, Mr. Stevens?
Yes, I have.
Super. So the conclusion, you cast your eye down to paragraph 8.7, is that the modelling results lead easily to a judgment that the proposed development would not have a severe impact on the highway network. We know where that terminology severe comes from. It comes from the framework.
Correct.
I didn't take you to that. So that's the conclusion. An easy judgment reached, no severe impact on the highway network. As a matter of overall judgment, is that one with which you agree or disagree?
Completely disagree. The approach that's been taken is one of looking at delay on a corridor rather than understanding the deficiencies within a network that need to be overcome to support sustainable development.
I wonder, so are you getting a sort of bit of a boom on the microphone when Mr. Stevens speaks? Just slightly,
Maybe just move it
Distracting.
marginally further away.
or it might even be just turning it down a bit. I don't
Turn it
know.
down a little bit.
Let's see.
Is this any better?
That is a bit better, actually, yeah. I think you might have just been slightly too close to it.
Okay, I do apologise.
No, don't worry.
It's a conclusion that you don't accept now. Did you accept it on the basis of this transport assessment when you lodged your consultation response, Mr. Stevens?
Correct. At the time of reviewing this application, there was, I think the approach I didn't support. It was deficient in how it displayed its results, and a lot of the parameters that were used within the transport assessment I disagree with.
Okay. Now, given the proximity of the motorway network in this case, there is another highway authority involved, namely National Highways, as we know. Did National Highways accept the findings of this transport assessment when they considered its contents?
No, they had the same conclusions as myself. I think what's also important to highlight, whilst National Highways have motorways in the network, we've also got to have regard to which motorways they are. They are the 61, M6 and M65. So South Ribble is a very good catchment for that motorway network, which National Highways are responsible for.
Okay. Now,
Sorry, could I just get that again from you? Which motorways is it again?
The M61,
Yeah.
the M6 and the M65.
Okay. Thank you.
we know that the Strategic Highway Authority, National Highways, has recently written setting out its current position in a letter dated the 28th of July 2022, so just towards the end of last month. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have, and I have a copy in front of me, thank you.
Well, let's just all get there if we may. So it's in various places, including at CD 10.71. And we can perhaps note its conclusion. On the last page, last paragraph of the letter, that it's National Highways' view that as far as the strategic road network itself is concerned, the traffic impact of the development would be unlikely to be classed as severe within the context of the Department for Transport circular. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Or to result in a material detrimental, that's presumably you should say, impact to existing levels of safety. In reaching that conclusion, has National Highways now accepted the appellant's approach to assessing impact on the highway network?
No. Their conclusion was based on the work which Lancashire County Council undertook with support from National Highways.
All right. Now, you set out your concerns with the appellant's assessment in the body of your evidence. I want to run through some of those points. First of all, please, Mr. Stevens, we know, don't we, that what the appellants have done is created what's called a micro-simulation model for the area in which the appeal sites are located. Is that right?
That's correct.
And they've assessed impact arising out of the appeal schemes by looking at increased levels of delay along certain routes within that area. Is that right?
That is correct.
And if we turn up the TA, the transport assessment, at page 56, just to understand the extent of that exercise, page 56 shows us, doesn't it, the extent of the model in graphic form.
Bear with us for a few moments.
So, yes, that's going to be around the 60, 61 mark. 62. I'm adding 5, right. Okay.
62. Yeah.
So figure 7.1 on that page shows us the extent of the model within the micro-simulation exercise. Is that correct?
That is correct in what they've considered. Whether that is sufficient enough, that's a separate question.
Okay, no, we'll come back to adequacy and so on. Just take it in stages. And just for the inspector's note, if we look at the lower right-hand quadrant of that model, we can see where the M6 intersects with the M65, can't we?
That is correct.
That's part of the motorway network that we referred to earlier on briefly. The M61 comes into the M6 a little bit further north from that. You can just see that on the map, can't you?
Yes, that's correct.
It's not part of the model network, it's not highlighted in red, but that's where the M61 comes into play.
That's correct.
So that's the extent of the model. And then if we go to the next page, paginated 57, internal pagination 57, we can see 7 routes along which the journey time has been assessed by the appellants. Is that right?
That is correct.
So they picked those 7 routes and assessed journey times and delays associated with each of those routes. Now, as a general approach in terms of assessing impact of this scheme on the highway network, do you accept that that is sufficiently comprehensive or not?
No.
What are the limitations of looking at journey times and delays along those 7 routes in terms of trying to understand the effects of the scheme?
I think, first of all, you've got to consider the area of influence, as I tried to bring up before. It's one of having a full regard to route choice. This development only considers a small section of the network, and therefore if let's just say a vehicle was to change route from Preston city centre as a consequence of its own decision, rather than using London Road, which continues onto Route 3, that decision would have been made in Preston. So in some ways, to get an accurate representation of how the network will react under different scenarios and redistribution or assignment, it needs to go further into Preston to support those those decisions. Please can you repeat the question again, because I diverted.
No, not at all. It was a broad question, really. It was simply to ask whether or not looking at delays along 7 specified routes gave you a comprehensive view of the impact of the appeal schemes,
Yeah.
or whether you needed to do something else.
Well, with regard to delays, that is only one very small component. When we're looking at this network, what we have, let's for example take Route 1, there are very few points of delay on Route 1, so therefore one would expect a point of delay is a junction. Therefore one would expect a level of reliability on that. I think microsimulation comes into its own where there are numerous points of delay from various sources. Therefore you can look how each junction or each point of delay reacts with the other. In isolation, just having regard to delay does not tell, does not inform what the impacts are of a development in the isolated location. That's why the general approach which is used within the industry also primarily looks at operation of junctions and queuing at junctions.
All right. You've looked at the as we'll see in due course, you've looked at the operation of individual junctions. I think there are 7 of them in particular that you've examined broadly along the A582 corridor. Why do you say that that's necessary in order to gain a better idea of the likely impact of this scheme, as opposed to relying on the modelled journey times along these particular routes?
The concern I have in just looking at journey time, that tells me nothing how a location is performing, and in some ways I don't see that is in line with the MPPF and the paragraphs he previously took me to, which in particular 1110 subparagraph D, that capacity and congestion on the highway or on highway safety can cost effectively mitigated to an acceptable degree. Just having that understanding of this is the increase in journey time tells me very little. And whilst you could increase the demand by whatever %, it would just increase the journey time. But what we have with this particular model, because the assignment of trips is fluid, it can assign trips to other parts of the network that's been modelled. Therefore you'll never get a true reflection of what the impacts are, and also I would say it undermines the highway hierarchy, in this particular case the prominent A582, which is used for more longer distance travel.
Okay, we're going to come back to trip distribution in a moment or two and how vehicles are assigned across the network, and try to understand how the impacts of the appeal scheme are felt. So we'll come back to that. Whether you're adopting the use of a micro simulation model or whether you're looking at the performance of individual junctions, Mr. Stevens, the assessment needs to start with an understanding of how the network is operating now. Is that right?
That is correct. However, we can't consider now as being typical. We've got to look at a typical time frame, which from my perspective and of the perspective of Croft Consulting was prior to the influence of COVID.
Let's just take this in stages. In terms of understanding how the network is operating now, is it a question of going out onto the roads and counting cars?
That is correct.
So you undertake a survey. We know, in this case, that the appellants conducted surveys to inform their assessment in April 2021.
That is correct.
What are your concerns about that?
That traffic data is not typical of the network. I suspect if we were to undertake a traffic count now, obviously we're now after the summer holidays, those traffic levels would be much higher. During COVID, conditions on the network were completely different, and it's not one of simply using that data and then factoring it up. because that would give an unreasonable representation. Because whilst during COVID there was a level of home working, we know those conditions have changed. We know those conditions over winter will change again. In some ways, it's important to have a strong starting point that is using unbiased data.
Just by way of an illustration of your concerns, can we turn up your main proof, please? Page 35, which contains a table. And amongst other things, Mr. Stevens, it gives some traffic flows on the I think it probably should read on the title to the table 582 rather than 585, Penwortham Way.
Yes, good apologise.
In various time intervals at various points in the year. So we've got May 19, May 21, April 22 and May 22. So just looking at the May 19 and May 21 flows, what is broadly the picture presented in those two columns? In the space of 2 years, what's happening to the flows?
As a consequence of COVID, the limitations of movement taking place, in May 21, the traffic levels at all time periods are lower.
Fast forward a year to May 22, so probably the same.
They are broadly the same.
Presumably broadly the same survey date. Don't know when in May these are from, but what's happened by May 22 by reference to that last column of figures?
They are slightly up from May 21, however they are much lower than May 19.
What do you suggest that says about relying on traffic surveys to understand what the current network is doing, where those surveys are undertaken in April 2021? How representative are April 2021 figures in your view?
They're not representative to be typical for the network.
We're going to come to the outcome of your assessment in a moment or two, but just by way of contrast, what did you do in trying to understand a representative position as far as current traffic flows were concerned?
In the approach that I took forward as part of my proof of evidence, working closely with National Highways, is to use the data from 2019, which is the same data that Croft Consulting, representing the appellant, used. As I highlighted earlier on, it's one of consistent use of data that can be relied upon.
Now, what Mr. Axon says about that, if we turn up his rebuttal proof, Mr. Axon says on page 2 of his rebuttal proof, paragraph 1.11, is that much has happened since the pre-COVID world. And he lists 6 things. His paragraph 1.11 of his rebuttal proof.
Yep.
Do you have that?
Yep.
The first 2 of them are physical changes to the highway network, namely the completion of the Penwortham bypass and the completion of a stretch of the Crossborough Link Road between Carwood Road and the Causey. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you accept that those physical changes to the network mean that you shouldn't be relying on the background flows that you've used in your assessment?
No, I'm still happy with the data that I've used. With regard to Penwortham bypass, as its name implies, it was to take the key benefit of it was to take the traffic away from Penwortham, and the benefits that would be provided within Penwortham would be there to support sustainable transport and the local community. With regard to the influence of Penwortham bypass on the network, whilst it have, I'm looking at figure 7.2 is my reference point,
So are you back in the transport
in
assessment?
the transport assessment,
Showing the 7 routes.
showing the 7 routes. It shows the intersection.
Just can you just hold on one moment? Sorry. Some of us looking at this electronically. Sorry. The 7 routes. So PDF page 63, I think so.
Yep.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Just point out where you're looking on this plan,
Right,
please, Mr.
I'll
Stevens.
go back. Penwith Bypass, which is the east-west section of the blue route, which is Route 1. Sorry, the bypass is in green, that's Route 7. And that then transferred the traffic to Route 1, the blue section, going towards Preston, providing relief to Penwith, which is it coloured in yellow, which is Route 5. The impacts of Penwith Bypass in green 7, as you go further southbound away from the bypass, has lesser impact. The only impacts that it does have in redistribution or reassignment as a consequence of delivering changes is one of reducing rat running on 2 of the lanes, which is Pope Lane and Chainhouse Lane. Unfortunately, they are not that clear on this plan. However, Pope Lane is south of the roundabout. Chainhouse Lane is opposite the pink route, Route 6. So that reduces the level of reassignment. My issues that I have with the influence of this development is not on Route 1, the blue route. The Highway Authority has delivered many changes to those key junctions over a number of years. So my concern really is with Route 2. So the influence of the Penwith bypass, we'll say on Route 2, is negligible.
Right, and what about the completion of part of the Crossborough Link Road? How does that affect the operation of junctions under existing conditions along what we're calling Route 2, which is that southern stretch of the A582?
Again, has very little impact. With regard to the section of the Crossborough Link Road, which in essence links Route 4 to the roundabout, the northern roundabout of Route 3, which is highlighted in green, the way that was determined, the impact of that was using transport assessments that were produced to support that original scheme. So therefore, it is a reasonable baseline to assume what the impacts, what they would be. And again, going back to the impacts on Route 2, which is my main concern, but also at Tardy Gate, which is the intersection of Route 4 and Route 6, those two schemes have very little impact.
All right. So in terms of your areas of concern, those physical changes to the network haven't really made any difference. They've affected other parts of the network. The next 3 factors are all broadly related in Mr. Axon's paragraph 1.11. So at Roman 3, 4 and 5, in effect, they're all COVID-related factors. By reference to the figures that we've seen in your table showing traffic flows along the 582 over the years, May 19, April 20, May 21, May 22, what's your view about whether you can take comfort from the fact that traffic levels dropped significantly during the COVID pandemic, and whether in effect that sets a new baseline for the operation of the network?
The May 21 data is a very low base point compared to what it was like in May 19. As can be seen going forward in time, those traffic levels are increasing. So it cannot be considered as a reasonable base point, as a reasonable start for modelling purposes. In essence, it will underestimate the impacts.
And then the last of Mr. Axton's 6 points is a stronger emphasis on acting to minimise climatic effects. So I don't know where he's saying that, whether that's a policy emphasis or legal emphasis or general societal emphasis. I'm not entirely sure. But what evidence is there in South Ribble that a greater concern about climate change is, if you like, resetting the baseline for traffic?
I think that undermines the whole process, but going back to a point that I've previously made, in minimising climatic effects, it's about providing that real choice that people can make their journeys using whatever mode, and actually supporting the area is about having a network which is fit for purpose and gives good level of performance, and it's not one of predict and provide either.
Okay. Let's, in the interest of moving things on, let's move to the next stage in the process. So, having tried to establish what current conditions are like in terms of an existing baseline for the assessment, we then try and project forward that baseline to a future year when this appeal scheme is going to have been completed. Often called the design year, or there's some other terminology applied, but we know, don't we, we cast our eyes back to the transport assessment where that figure 7.2 is shown. Look at the foot of that page, paragraph 7.8, under the heading Scenario Testing.
Yeah.
We know that the appellants have considered the position in 2031, is that right?
They've highlighted a date of 2031, correct?
Yeah, well, that's, if you like, the design year scenario, 2031 base. Do you accept 2031 to be the right base, future base year?
Not having regard to the scale of development that is planned for, let's just say, 1,100 units. It's not possible to build it out. As part of, I think it's the previous work with Croft, I think they had a base year of 2035, and that is the approach that I've taken, being a reasonable year that development could be built out. However, even that may not be satisfied, and it may go beyond 2035, even with the greatest will of the house builder on board, when regard is then had to the one access outlet on the A582.
All right. Well, I'm not going to ask you about speed of sales, the commercial point of that sort. I'm going to strictly restrict myself to transport-related issues, Mr. Stevens. Now, in the intervening period between now and the design year, there are going to be other schemes likely to be developed in the locality that are currently in the development pipeline and that have planning permissions, and those are referred to as commitments. Yeah, and there are 6 of them in this case, and I believe it to be one of the very few matters upon which you, Mr. Axton, agree as to the contents of that list of 6. Is that right?
We agree on the list, that's correct.
Super. In terms of how the appellants have treated the traffic generated by, perhaps before I ask that question, those commitments, if built, will provide a certain level of traffic, generate a certain level of traffic. Is there agreement as to that likely level of traffic from each of those 6 commitments?
Well, the level of traffic will be an output of each of the transport assessments.
Yeah. So Mr. Axton says he's relied on their transport assessments to understand that level of traffic. Is that what you've done?
That is correct.
Fine. That traffic has then got to be distributed around the network. Are you satisfied with how the appellants have approached distributing the traffic from those 6 commitments around the network?
Unfortunately, the approach undertaken using the microsimulation, whilst we may have the origin being the development and the destination as per the transport assessment where possible, the routing choice through the network has been left to the microsimulation model to determine, and it may be the case that routing may use inappropriate roads not following the highway hierarchy. The approach that I've taken is one of using the transport assessment, where if the transport assessment does not go far enough, I've then continued that using the general distribution and assigning traffic to those corridors as per the proportion of traffic flows at a particular junction, i.e. proportioning it out, which is used within the industry.
All right. I'm going to come back to the distribution of traffic in the context of the appeal schemes traffic. So there's traffic from those 6 committed schemes that has to be fed into the, if you like, the base flow for the design year. And apart from that traffic, it's the case, isn't it, and the appellants tell us this very clearly in their evidence, Mr. Axon's clear about this, that they've not allowed for any other traffic growth in the intervening period. Mm-hmm. Their intervening period finishing in 2031, yours 2035. Do you accept that as a proper approach, not allowing for any other growth beyond that from the 6 committed schemes?
That approach clearly underestimates what those future traffic levels will be on the network. In some ways, the industry uses software called Tempro, which is gets supported by the Department for Transport. It is industry standard and industry used. In not using that software will result in traffic flows being much less than what would happen in reality. National Highways also support, as generally the industry also supports the use of that software without double counting traffic, because if for the large sites you would say is because Tempro uses what is expected to come forward in that local area, but also in the wider area where there is a proportion of the traffic from the area in influence as a consequence of committed, you then discount that away from the Tempro growth, removing the double counting. Therefore gives a much reasonable estimate of what is likely to happen in the future.
Hang on, let's try and unpack that for a second. We have these growth factors derived from a program called Tempro, which I think is administered by the Department for Transport. Is that right?
That is correct.
They are produced in respect of particular areas within the country, aren't they?
They can be broken down, absolutely.
And when you would apply them to go from current flows to a future flow in, say, this area,
yeah.
Is it your understanding that they would include, in effect, account for committed development that has to be allowed for in any event?
It does include that. That's where you then discount.
So if you know what those commitments are, you then make an adjustment to those temporary factors to avoid what you call double counting. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. When you've done your assessment, in addition to the traffic from the 6 agreed commitments, have you then applied a further growth factor derived from Tempro, having deducted for the commitments, if you like?
What I've done, I've included Tempro minus commitment and the committed.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can you just say that again? I've included Tempro minus 2 things. What were the 2 things?
It's Tempro minus the committed elements within Tempro and the committed development.
Committed elements within Tempro and the committed developments.
Okay. You still got Mr. Axon's rebuttal proof. Have you still got Mr. Axon's rebuttal proof? Okay, turn on to page 15 within that, please, if you would. Where he notes this difference between paragraph 152. He says, in that paragraph, a big difference between my forecast and Mr. Stevens' forecast of the application of further traffic growth to the network. Mr. Stevens has, in addition to all of the above, applied a blanket traffic factor uplift to traffic on the network to account for something called Tempro, which he then tells us what that is in the subsequent paragraph. Okay. Over the page, 3 points are made by him as an argument not to do that. Okay? Or not to do it in the way you've done it. So first, please, paragraph 154. First sentence says, the DFT, Department for Transport, recognises that the N10 forecast, sorry for the jargon, but in effect the growth factors produced by Tempro, that's the N10 forecast, are subject to uncertainty. So that's the first reason. It says don't use Tempro because they're subject to uncertainty. Do you accept that as a reason not to apply those growth factors?
That's the reason why we do include that level of growth, because of the uncertainty. It is one of expected level of growth, and as I highlighted earlier, it's not due to what's happening in this area, but it's also what's happening in neighbouring areas.
If the fact that the growth factors produced by Tempro was subject to uncertainty, which of course they are, they're forecast, all forecasts are to a degree uncertain. If that was a reason not to use them, would they ever be used?
If they weren't supposed to be used, they wouldn't be used. In this particular case, this is appropriate software which is used within the industry and supported by the DFT as the correct approach, therefore should be included.
The next point made is that, and it starts at 154 and goes into 155, the DFT, the Department for Transport, in effect are downgrading the forecasts on account of various different growth projections, and on the 8th of August, this is 155, it issued updated growth data sets which are considerably lower than those that you've used. That's the point being made there. Do you accept that those 8th of August 2022 growth factors should be used in the assessment?
No.
Why not?
Whilst that information was presented on the 8th of August, the release date is not until November 22, and there's a reason for that. At this stage, they are not certain whether the background numbers within there are accurate at this stage, and it's one of allowing the industry to get to know this new update before it can be used later in the year. And I suspect it may come with further revisions
Right.
in the meantime.
Third point, it's a general observation that is made by Mr. Axon at paragraph 159. He says that the County Council are prioritising generic uncertain growth based on its interpretation from an old version of Tempro over this specific proposal for an allocated site. Do you accept that criticism?
No. We've used Tempro. Obviously, it is not the version that has been released on the 8th of August. I think it was one below what's currently the latest now, and I think the net difference is 1%.
So you're content with the version of Tempro that you've used,
Yep.
but in terms of the allegation that you're prioritising generic uncertain growth, so that's, if you like, the growth in traffic forecast by Tempro, you're prioritising that over this specific proposal. Is that a fair criticism?
No, I think what's important is to have a clear understanding of what's expected to happen on the network in a future year. So you have to consider all those parameters which will make up the full level of traffic on the network. That includes Tempro.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. We've been discussing, if you like, the first step in the process, which is to try and understand what the background traffic is going to look like on the network, both currently and in the design year. Haven't yet got to what the appeal schemes are likely to generate, the trip generation from these proposals. Let's just turn to that. Can we go back to the transport assessment to understand what the appellants have done? So this time, section 6, which starts on page 42, which I'm guessing is about 47 or 48 in the PDF numbered
What's the
edition. So internal 42.
48. 48 PDF.
Thank you. And it's a section headed trip generation and distribution. You got that?
Mm-hmm.
The first, and again, I'm going to try and take this relatively swiftly. You deal with these points in your evidence, but the first step in the appellants have taken in seeking to get an understanding of how much traffic the scheme is likely to generate is an interrogation of something called the TRIX database. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you accept that as a potentially legitimate starting point for trying to understand what the appeal scheme is likely to generate by way of traffic?
TRIX is a proprietary piece of software that's used within the industry. It is one way to determine the level of trips, whether it's person trips or vehicle trips, from a development site. However, the downside to TRIX in itself, it does not necessarily consider all the local influences of an area such as South Ribble.
Okay. The result of Mr. Axon's and his colleagues' interrogation of the TRIX database is table 6.1 at the top of page 43, I'm guessing 49 of the transport assessment. Average total person trip rates and trips. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Per dwelling. And then a total, that's the first half of the table, and then that's factored up to represent numbers of trips for the 1,100 dwellings.
That is correct.
What was the table number? Sorry.
Table 6.1,
6.1.
top of the next page.
Thank you.
Okay. There's another table on that page, 6.2, which then splits those trips throughout the day between three different purposes: commuting, education, recreation and leisure, by reference to percentage proportions. You got that?
Yes, I have.
And that exercise has been done by reference to something called the National Travel Survey, which is referred to in the paragraph that precedes table 6.2. The National Travel Survey has been looked at to come up with those proportions. Now, Mr. Stevens, do you accept that exercise as representative of the likely position in this part of central Lancashire?
No, it's, as the title indicates, it's a national travel survey, having no regard to this local area. If regard was had to the local area, they would have used information such as a roadside information or roadside survey, where you could get that commuting, education, recreational, being very specific to the site. Using the national travel survey is national, doesn't have regard to local matters.
Why might it be different here?
I think the starting point is we've got a high level of use of the private car. If possible, may I take you to my appendices? I think it's Appendix 18, which has got the census information. Yes, Appendix 18.
This is the car availability census data,
That's
travel to
correct.
work, is that right?
And on the first page of that, it's got a table.
Just explain what all of these figures are and how they've been derived, please.
This is census information from 2011. It's the most recent census information that we have, and this is about the first table, as I'm highlighting, highlights the car ownership. And the greater the level of car ownership for an area, it generally would be the greater use of the private car. On the first page, it's got lots of areas, and then if you go 2/3 of the way down that particular page, it's got Lancashire. And then you go 3 up from the bottom, within Lancashire, it's got South Ribble. And that sort of highlights the total number of households. Then you go to the far right, it highlights the total number of cars or vans for that area, South Ribble as a whole. If you divide the number of cars by the number of households, you'll get that car ownership. And in this particular case, for South Ribble, based upon the census, you get a factor of 1.36 cars per dwelling.
What do you say about that level in relative terms?
It's very high when compared to Lancashire, the North West, and even to England as a whole. So then for when we are looking at the National Travel Survey, what we can say is there's a higher propensity to use the private car. If I can then take you on to the next table, since we have this information out, which is highlighted table CT0015.
Can you just give me one
Sorry,
moment?
which-
Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up. Please just pause for a moment. Sorry.
So hang on, there's Mr. Stevens. I've got, I think, 5 sheets of census information in respect of car ownership that finishes with a sheet where the last entries are for Wales.
Correct.
And then if I go over the page from there, I've got a table in landscape form, which is headed extract from table CT0015, 2011 census, method of travel to work, brackets alternative local authorities in England and Wales. Is that right?
That's correct.
What,
This
again, tell us what this is and where
this
it's from.
table ranks where Lancashire lies and the different districts in Lancashire, how they rank in the use of various modes of transport for the
what
journey
purpose?
to work.
For
The journey to work.
Yeah.
And what can be seen, again, 3 up from the bottom, you've got South Ribble,
Yeah.
2/3 across, you've got driving a car or van. South Ribble is ranked 12th highest in the country. Again, a higher propensity to use the private car.
All right.
And again, if we then go to the last page, to get us out of the way.
I'm ever so sorry. Is the 12th highest on this page that we're looking at? Sorry. I'm just trying to follow what was being said. Sorry. Is this the last page of the appendix we're looking at?
Can you just explain, Mr. Stevens, looking at the sheet table CT0015, you've said that South Ribble is ranked 12th in respect of driving a car or van to work.
Yeah.
In respect of what geographical area? 12th from what?
England, well, it's out of England and Wales. Because that's highlighted in the title.
Okay.
Sorry, my question was where's the 12th? Sorry, I just.
If
I'm
we-
not sure
where
I'm
is
looking
the
at
12?
I'm not sure I'm looking at the right page.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay, so it's
Forgive me.
No, that not at all. It's after the 5 sheets of
Oh, yeah.
census,
As soon as I asked, I found it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
and it's the one.
Thank you. I've got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's CT0015, and I think you were then going over the page again, Mr. Stevens.
Yes, just to get all 3 of the census information, get all the information out there. Again, what we have here is for South Ribble as a whole. Looking at, again, it is that journey to work, which is used within the industry to understand what the propensity is to use a particular mode for that journey. What it highlights here for South Ribble is for all those work purposes, but it also includes those who are not in employment. It highlights 47.2% will drive a car or a van to work. And then, as you can see, it does include the various other percentages for all the other modes. And what can be seen with regard to using public transport, at the moment those numbers are not as high as, let's just say, Burnley, which is at the top, and Preston, which is halfway up. So from a transport perspective, what we know is most people are using the private car.
Yeah. Sorry, just so we understand, just so we understand what this table is telling us. This is not ranking, not giving us rankings. It's giving us a percentage value for modes of getting to work. And in respect of driving a car or van, which again is one of the headings to one of the columns, we can find the entry to South Ribble, and the figure there for driving a car or van to work as a percentage figure within South Ribble is 47.2. Is that right?
That is correct.
Just by reference to that figure, what is your point, Mr. Stevens?
The point is, whilst we've got the average, the person trip rate, in South Ribble, there's that high car ownership and there is that propensity to use the private car, certainly for the journey to work. Because there are high car ownership, there is the propensity to use the private car for other journey purposes.
Okay. That was, having been on that quite long little diversion down the census data, it's all relevant, of course, Mr. Stevens, so thank you for taking us there. Just go back to the transport assessment, page 43/49 in the PDF, and table 6.2.
That is based...
Hang on, let me just formulate the question. So there we have these splits of trips by reference to commuting, education and recreation and leisure that we previously looked at, derived from the National Travel Survey. Now, if you've got those wrong for South Ribble, they don't apply to South Ribble, are not representative of South Ribble, and for example, you've got too many leisure trips as opposed to commuting, what is the effect of that likely to be on the analysis of impact of the appeal scheme when thinking about its trip generation and distribution?
It will significantly influence the distribution of traffic. What is also interesting with regard to this, obviously whilst I don't support the use of the National Travel Survey because doesn't have any local connection because it's national, there is a difference, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but it's worth highlighting whilst we have this particular table available. Whilst it splits into 3 groups, the peak hour for the network is 7:30 to 8:30 and not 8 till 9. So even if these were accurate, in which I don't think they are to represent the area, you can see that significant difference in the proportions between each time slice. So therefore, depending on what your time frame is, for each of those purposes, it's going to change the distribution. So no reliance can be provided on the approach that's been taken forward by Vectos.
All right. We've looked at what Mr. Axon has done in terms of deriving proportion of trips by reference to purpose. What this assessment then does, having done that exercise, is split those trips across different ways of travelling. So if we go over the page again, so this is pages 44 and 45, 60 and 61 in the PDF of the transport assessment. We've got that.
Yeah.
Starts with commuting trips, paragraph 6.11. Yeah.
Yep.
And we can look at table 6.4 on page 45, where different modes of travel are set out, and Mr. Axon has, if you like, divided up commuting trips. He does it by reference to two different things: destinations within a 5 kilometre radius and destinations beyond, but he divides up commuting trips between different modes of travel. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And we're told that he does that by reference to census data that is obviously locally specific.
Yeah.
And presumably you support, assuming which you don't accept, is the numbers of commuting trips, the proportion of commuting trips generally is right, which you don't accept, you've explained. But looking at how people travel in this area by reference to census data is presumably something that you support, Mr. Stevens, given what you've just said.
Yes, that particular MSOA boundary is identified in figure 6.1. That is the same area which was used by Croft Consulting, and for consistency I have also used the same. So there's no dispute there.
Just turn over the page again, page 46, paragraph 614 in the transport assessment, where he tells us that applying the mode split in table 6.4 to the commuting trips in table 6.3 results in the demand as summarised in table 6.5, which is below. Do you see that?
Yes.
He then says, though, that an internalisation factor of 5% was also applied to person trips to take account of trips occurring within the site and people working from home. So, if you like, there's a discount made for commuters on the basis that some of them are going to be working within the site and from home, therefore won't be making trips outside of the site at all.
Yeah.
Do you know where the 5% adjustment comes from, where that figure comes from, what the evidence is that supports it?
Well, nothing's been presented to highlight the origins of that.
Now, for the education trips, this page goes on, the passages below, tables below, to set out the approach taken. So, again, look at table 6.6. We've got the mode of getting to school across various means, walking, cycling, car and so on, set out with the proportions of trips for each of them, firstly for schools within a mile of the site and then schools outside of a mile of the site. Do you see that? There are obviously different proportions apply to each. Now that exercise of coming up with those mode splits, to use the terminology, has been derived again from the National Transport Study. So not census data, local census data in this case, but national data that has information about how people get to school.
Yeah.
Do you accept that these proportionate splits by mode getting to school are necessarily representative of what happens in South Ribble?
No, I think the major concern here, there is, again, it's because it's based upon the National Travel Survey. I can't provide any reliance to that. But what we've also got to bear in mind, whilst I know they have got the correct number of schools in the area, it's the propensity that people will use sustainable modes to make their trip, having regard to all weather conditions. It's just trying to be realistic.
Okay. Lastly, in terms of how Mr. Axon goes about understanding how many cars are going to be generated by the site, the recreation and leisure trips, and you'll find that dealt with on page 49, 54, probably in the PDF version. Starts at paragraph 6.19.
Yeah.
And what he tells us at paragraph 621 is that because there's no National Travel Survey database showing mode splits for leisure and recreation trips, what he's done is use the same mode split as that used to distribute the commuting trips, which you'll remember was derived from the census information.
Yeah.
So that's what he's done as far as coming up with mode splits for leisure and recreation. Have you got anything to say about that exercise of trying to divide those trips up as between forms of transport?
Well, it's using the commuting trips. Obviously, I've used commuting to be my approach. So from that perspective, you could say it's not unreasonable. However, when we have regard to how they're distributed around the network, that's when it does create an issue, because if they don't include all the correct destinations, again, it will significantly influence the distribution of where those trips are going.
Sorry, can you just explain that, please?
They have used, obviously, the commuting as their approach for recreational, because there is no information in the National Trip Survey.
In deriving the mode split, you mean?
In deriving the mode splits,
Yeah.
they've just used a very simple approach, but they're trying to be too specific with regard to particular modes. I've used an approach which is just using that journey to work, which I think is more than reliable. But what we have, because they have split up in providing greater level of uncertainty on the accuracy of the approach, because they have used a proportion based upon the National Travel Survey.
Just cast your eye back up the text, please, to paragraph 620.
Yeah.
What Mr. Axon tells us there is that for the purposes of assessment, a judgment has been made that 50% of leisure and recreation trips are internal trips which remain within the site. 50% are external trips which travel off-site. So half of those leisure and recreation trips, and we're told broadly what they are, and some examples given in paragraph 6.19, walking the dog, visiting friends, day-to-day shopping, such as a pint of milk, other shopping, personal business, holiday, day trips, etc. He assumes that half of them are kept within the site. What's the evidence you've seen to support that assumption? Or, sorry, judgment?
There's very little information available, but in some ways, when they've looked at leisure and recreation, whilst they've highlighted some of the simple things such as the walking dog, visiting friends, shopping, but in some ways it is about all those other aspects. There's very few of those elements you can actually do within the site. So that 50% reduction is incorrect. That percentage should be nearer zero, or a very low percentage.
All right. Just cast your eye down to paragraph 622 on this page. Is when we start to think about trip distribution, having looked at Mr. Axon's approach to understanding how many cars are doing what for what reason, commuting, education, leisure and recreation. He says, by way of introduction to his assessment of distribution, is that the development trips have been assigned to the local road network using a similar pattern to the trip generation exercise, with the distribution split between commuting, education and recreation and leisure. So, if you like, the direction this traffic goes in depends upon their purpose, obviously, their destination. And therefore, it's dictated by what you think that traffic is doing. Is it commuting? Is it going to school?
Yeah.
Or is it going to the shops, for example? if one gets that wrong in terms of the proportions of commuters, school attenders and shoppers, if you get that split wrong, what will it do to Mr. Axon's assessment of distribution?
Well, the distribution will be incorrect, but also the number of trips are also going to be incorrect when regard is had to the level of discounting being undertaken.
Just whilst we're on the point of distribution of traffic, there's that concern about what the traffic is doing and the numbers commuting, others going for education and so on. Do you have any other concerns about the approach to distributing traffic across the network that the appellants have adopted?
I think one of the concerns that I do have is, obviously it relates back to the leisure trips, where they've only put a limited number of leisure endpoints. For example, Penwitham Leisure Centre or Preston City Centre. And in Preston City Centre, for example, only has twice the amount of traffic going to Penwitham Leisure Centre for the whole duration, which to me seems slightly out. On top of that, there is then the issue of all the other sites which have been excluded, whether it's those within South Ribble in close proximity to the site, whether it's the leisure centre at Bamber Bridge, whether it is that which is provided in the tennis centre, the shopping that's available at the capital centre, the leisure centre at the capital centre. So all those inaccuracies, whilst they may all be small in number, when you start to summate them together, it highlights the overall number of trips is woefully inaccurate.
Okay. So you think that they've in effect missed some leisure recreation destinations in the analysis?
Correct.
All right. Let's go back to page 57 of the transport assessment. It's the page that has the 7 routes on. Page 63 PDF, I think it was. Figure 7.2 appears on the page. We then have the scenarios that have been tested, bearing in mind all of what you've said about base flows, trip generation and trip distribution. The scenarios tested by Mr. Axon are then set out his paragraph 7.8 in the transport assessment. Do you see that?
Yes.
3 on the foot of this page, which is the 2021 base position, the 2031 base position together with committed development, brackets no dualling. I'm going to come back to dualling in a minute. So that's no development yet. And then the third scenario is the 2031 base position plus the commitments plus the development at 1,100 dwellings. You see that?
Yep.
And then over the page we note that he tests a further 3 scenarios with a larger number of dwellings, 1,350 or 2,000. Yeah.
Yep.
And for the 1,350 with and without the dualling, and that refers to the A582, which we'll come back to.
Yep.
And in respect of each of those scenarios, I can summarise this and need to take you to it, but the results are set out in the following pages. For each of those scenarios, it's his conclusion that with the development traffic added, there will be no substantial difference made to the operation of the local highway network. That's the conclusion. No substantial difference as a result of the appeal scheme. Firstly, Mr. Stevens, given the appellant's approach to base flows that we've discussed,
Yep.
to trip generation and to distribution, is that a conclusion that can be safely relied upon?
No, there's too many areas of not considering the full impacts, the base information being incorrect. So it's always going to give a more positive outcome than what will happen in reality.
Now, you've expressed your reservations about looking at delays across 7 identified routes, and you've said that that doesn't give you a full enough picture. You've looked at the performance of identified individual junctions, haven't you?
That's correct.
Why have you done that?
In some ways, I think what's important is when we're having regard to the network, how it operates as a whole, but more importantly, where you've got the pinch points, these areas where there are concerns, where we don't have network reliability, also having regard to the MPPF, we've got to look at those pinch points to get a clear understanding of the significance of the issue and how much of this impact is as a consequence of development.
I just want to run through some of the aspects of your approach, having decided to look at individual junctions. Firstly, trip generation from the appeal scheme. What have you done to try and identify trip generation from the 1,100 dwellings in the appeal schemes?
The approach that I've done was the same approach that was used by Croft Consulting. Again, going back to that word consistency. That was using observed information from a site in Bamber Bridge, which is a reasonable representation for the area, having regard to the census information. And that gave its own trip rate, which were supported by National Highways. National Highways, they did their own review, looking at the standard proprietary software tricks, but were still satisfied with that local trip rate that was generated.
You say you looked at a site in Bamber Bridge. Did you look at any other sites?
So that was used by Croft. We adopted that to support or to ensure that I wasn't being unreasonable. I then also looked at a couple of other sites, which is highlighted in my proof of evidence on page 38, and the results highlighted in table 4. I looked at 2 other locations, and one of those locations, which is Saxon Place, is highlighted as recent development near Beer Lane roundabout, i.e. next to the Causey. So I went to that site twice to get an understanding of, having regard to a scale of development, what would the trip generation would be. So that was done at 2 sites, and what that highlights, during 2022, the trip rates are much higher than those agreed and used with Croft. So therefore, one may say I'm not indicating that I've got enough impact, but being reasonable, and as this site coming forward is providing certain provision within, I suppose on balance they're going to be accurate. And my trip rates are higher than those which have been used by Vectos.
So you've looked at 3 local sites to understand the level of trip generation from those in order to inform your view about what this site is likely to generate. I think what Mr. Axon says is that, well, that's all very, very well and good, but they're not this site and they're not this development. They're considerably smaller, they're not mixed use, they have different characteristics, and therefore they're not representative. Do you accept those observations?
No. As this site is obviously the sites where I've collected information, 2 days worth of 2 peaks from, as highlighted in my table, was for a site very close to the one in question. The second one is in a large area called Northwest Preston, where several thousand dwellings are coming forward, of which a proportion are already built out. So therefore, having regard to them being reasonable to represent the site in question, of course they are, because it's based upon local information. I think what's also worth bearing in mind when looking at the tricks information that Vectos have used, whilst I do note and I do accept the use of tricks, it's a good piece of software that is used within the industry. They have used, broken it down and have 15 days worth of data. The starting point, you'd say, is quite good. However, that's nationally, then of which 5 of those days are for sites where they have car ownership of 0.6 vehicle per dwelling, and we know in South Ribble we are over double that. So that highlights initially that the trip rates used will underestimate what's going to happen in reality. With regard to the scale, again, you look at the sites in question which the Vectos have used. The majority of those sites are between 200 and 300 units, and I think there's only 2 or 3 days where they are 800 to 900 units. I did a little bit of analysis myself, and is there a level of link between scale of development and trip rate? And the answer is no, there isn't. In the 15 days that were chosen, it is all random, and the trip levels are based upon local criteria that influences the level of generation.
All right. Again, in the interest of trying to move things forward, let's just think about distribution. What's your approach to the distribution, having established what you say is a reasonable projection of traffic generation from the site? What's been your approach to how you distribute that traffic around the network?
I've taken the same approach that Croft undertook, using census information and the journey to work. I think that is a really strong starting point. I updated the Croft approach, not with the census data because that was fixed. I had regard to the summation of trips which were, for example, they'll go to a destination, let's say Wigan, and in the Croft approach it may only allocate 1 trip to one area of Wigan, when in reality Wigan has many areas. So in the summation of those trips within Wigan, if they became greater than 4, I would then include them. The benefit of that approach, it has a greater understanding of what the actual distribution is going to be, rather than making it too localised. With regard to assignment, moving on, I used the assignment that, again, that's how from the network, from the origin to the destination, what route choice is taken. Again, I followed the Croft approach. Where it was deficient, I looked at the journey times using Google, looking at origin, destination, and the routes that were taken. Predominantly, they were all keeping to the primary road network, rather than using an approach which allows traffic to circulate on less hierarchical roads to get to their destination. It's important that the highway hierarchy is maintained, and my approach ensured that is the case.
The results of your analysis, Mr. Stevens, I think are summarised in your proof from page 90 onwards, where you set out the 7 junctions that you've looked at individually. I'm not going to take you through each of those. There are a series of tables that record how those junctions perform in the base year, which for you is 2035, with and without the development. Can you just summarise your view as to whether or not, in respect of those junctions, they operate acceptably with the development without any mitigation works having been conducted upon them?
No. It's fairly clear from my modelling results at these isolated locations. In the future, when development is added, the network does deteriorate and will be operating beyond theoretical capacities. What it highlights is the level of unreliability of the network, excessive queuing and delay. And in some ways, going back to the MPPF, paragraph 1110, subparagraph D, highlighting in terms of capacity and congestion and how safety can be cost effectively mitigated. In this case, what I'm highlighting, there is mitigation required.
I think you tell us in your proof, don't you, which of the junctions you say crosses the threshold of severe impact. I don't think they all do, but you tell us which, in your view, do cross that threshold. Is that right?
That's correct. The junctions that I've got greatest concern are those relating to Crosson Road. It's the...
Could you just, ever so sorry to interrupt you, could you give us a table number so that later on I know what you've been talking about, sorry, in your proof, because each junction has a table.
Okay.
Sorry.
The first junction that I have concern is highlighted in table 12. That is known as Tardy Gate. They are 3 link junctions, and if you were to do a site visit, certainly during the evening peak, that highlights that there's queuing from Tardy Gate going back to the proposed access for this site. Tardy Gate is within the built environment, so that is my first junction that I have concern. It currently operates at theoretical capacity, whilst only 40 units, as identified in the transport assessment, will only exit at this location. Assume that is the case, it still makes this junction marginally worse, but the starting point is there are concerns.
Well, let me just ask you about that whilst we've got page 94 and table 12 of your proof of evidence open. And we can see a whole series of red figures in the 2018 base year, certainly in respect of the PM peak.
Yep.
More red figures in the 2035 base year, once you've added in the committed traffic as well. Not confined to the PM peak, but beginning to become more frequent in the AM position. And then a similar state of affairs once you add in the development in 2035. Do you see that?
That's correct.
Why do you say that adding in the development is unacceptable in terms of impact at that junction without undertaking mitigation works, given that it, if you like, is already operating at an overcapacity position, quite seriously so, without the development in 2035?
In some ways, going down a route of being sustainable, whilst this, in vehicle terms, the impacts are, there's a marginal increase, but it's about supporting the sustainable impacts from the development in question. For example, if you are a cyclist, where would that cyclist route using Leyland Road, which then links onto Tardy Gate, there isn't no mitigation. In some ways, mitigation is not down the route always of providing highway capacity. What I'm looking at here is looking at how we can better support sustainable transport. This is a corridor which is used by public transport. They've got levels of delay. That delay is only going to get worse over time, including with development. So in supporting sustainable site, I've highlighted that a level of mitigation is required, not necessarily overcoming capacity because it is a known problematic area, and as we're aware, it's also an air QMA, but what we need to do is try to better support sustainable movements at this location and on this corridor.
All right. That's table 12. Next, in terms of your particular areas of concern, Mr. Stevens.
It's then table 13, but also table 14. I'm linking these two together because they are, in essence, two conjoined roundabouts with a very short link road in between. What this highlights in the future is, whilst at the moment the junctions do suffer from congestion, looking at table 13, it highlights a particular queue, and then you move forward with, in a future of 2035, including committed, and then you add on the development, those queues increase significantly to 511 and then increase it to 614, for example, and that's on Croston Road. If you then go on to table 14, it's a similar picture.
Yep. Elsewhere?
The next junction where I have concern is table 15. This is it's known as Stanleyfield Lane signalised roundabout. At the moment, there is a high level of congestion at this location, and in the future that does increase. At the moment, the modelling results don't highlight, the way I present my evidence is honestly, and I've highlighted in my proof of evidence that I don't believe this junction is fully replicated within the modelling approach undertaken, and I've highlighted the reasons why. But what is clear is that this junction operates beyond capacity at the moment, and if you then look at that word PRC, that means practical reserve capacity. It's already highlighting it's beyond that now. When you add committed development, that increases. Then you add this development in question, that PRC value increases significantly. This corridor is a corridor which will be, as the main access from the site is the 582, going to most areas. The route that will be used is the 582 southbound or northbound, and then continuing through this junction. So that's one of the main reasons why those levels increase significantly. So it's a very clear improvement scheme required here. I must also highlight, within the situation of including committed or committed development, also includes the measures that were secured as part of that development. So we're not saying same old network. That is an improved network.
Right. Just trying to understand where are your areas of concern. I think table 16, another junction on the A582 between Penwitham Way, Chain House Lane. I don't think you contend for a severe impact there, do you?
No. Whilst the PRC is at a minus level, and you look at the future, yes, it goes worse, but as I've highlighted, we're not always predicting and providing. It's about that overall reliability and safety of the network. But it will be a future concern, but it's not a concern that I'm taking forward here.
And then the last one, table 17, the eastern end of the A582, I think it is what's referred to as the Sainsbury's roundabout. Is that an area of concern?
Yes. Same reason, when you add on the development, so you add the committed, it gets to a certain level way over practical reserve capacity, including improvements. You then add on this development, it gets far worse, okay, highlighting that it needs to be a cost-effective scheme to mitigate against its impacts.
All right. Briefly, just one or 2 points from Mr. Axon's rebuttal proof in terms of your approach. If you just go back to that for a moment, turn up paragraph 1.19 on page 6. It's the top of page 6. He refers to negative PRC, a ratio of flow to capacity above 85%, degree of saturation above 90%, various thresholds that are used in the analyses of the performance of junctions, and describes those as a mathematical hard stop on the development, which, if it were applied as policy across the UK, would prevent growth. Do you apply a mathematical hard stop having conducted those junction analysis to understand whether or not impacts are severe?
No, the last example I've given. No, we don't. It's got to have consider that bigger picture. And whilst I've highlighted 85 and 90%, they are practical capacities. I start to look at whether something is required when I'm above the theoretical percent, which is 100%. And then, as I've highlighted an example, even under that circumstance, I may not necessarily be suggesting that cost-effective mitigation is required.
Okay. All right. We can leave impacts on junctions and just briefly deal with one or two other points. Mr. Stevens, I think we'll be pleased to hear on the home stretch. The appellant advances what it says are going to be a series of other measures delivered as part of the scheme that will reduce car journeys from occupants of the proposed houses.
Mm-hmm.
Just want to run through one or two of those.
Okay.
Firstly, connections within and beyond the site for pedestrians and cyclists, including use of the existing lanes. I summarise it
Yep.
in the interests of efficiency. What's your view as to the likely success of those proposed arrangements, and in particular the likely success of reliance on the existing lanes for pedestrians and cyclists in large numbers?
I do have concerns with the use of the lanes for large numbers. Whilst one may think there's only be an impact of 40 units on B lane, what I've also got to have regard to is these are historic lanes and not necessarily there to support shared use. The government has gone down an approach of not supporting shared use. And I suppose a very simple question that I posed to myself, would I let my own child walk down those lanes with the high level use of other modes and servicing, etc.? The answer is no. I've got concerns with the lanes. I do also have concerns with how traffic from this site may actually be able to reach those lanes, exacerbating those conditions as identified in the transport assessment. That is notwithstanding potentially these lanes, and I haven't seen anything highlighting a strategy for emergency access. They may use these lanes. Efficient use of servicing for the site using the A582 is not efficient for the site. Again, it could be further questioned whether the lanes will be exacerbated.
Right, let's just try and take things one step at a time. Firstly, assume the use of the lanes in terms of vehicular traffic was limited to existing residents and business occupiers that currently use those lanes, plus the 40 dwellings accessed off B lane using that stretch of the lanes, the short stretch between the proposed access into that part of the site and the B lane bridge. So assume that you can restrict it to that and no more. Are you comfortable with that level of vehicular use and significant numbers of walkers and cyclists on the lanes?
I think generally on the lanes, I know the Public Rights of Way team have supported a package of measures to improve the lanes to support those movements. Whilst there may be scheme there that can support the movement, it doesn't necessarily mean that can overcome all the safety issues. That's before you get to the point of B lane and the issues at B lane bridge being able to support those high levels of movement from a sustainability perspective. So the answer would be no.
I'm going to come back to B lane bridge. Now the appellant says they can restrict it to those components of vehicular traffic and prevent other development traffic getting onto the lanes. And we've already looked in the inquiry at what was proposed in the master plan, some bollards at junctions where lanes cross new roads. It's been if you like, expanded upon in the evidence where some other arrangements have been suggested, including build-outs of roads and trees and so on and so forth. Just by reference to those physical measures, are you satisfied that they are likely to stop other development traffic getting onto the lanes?
No.
Why not?
Whilst 3 examples has been provided, there's many locations within the overall site where there are those points of risk where it's likely or highly likely that whatever provisions provided can be abused by development traffic. Whilst they've restricted the highway width at those locations, but those locations also need to be able to satisfy servicing and deliveries, emergency vehicles. That road width would need a standard service vehicle is 2.5 metres plus wing mirrors. So you're looking at a width of a box potentially of 3.5 metres by 3.5 metres.
So
In reality, what would happen, cars would be able to manoeuvre around that 3.5 metre square
so
to access the lanes.
in your view, vehicles will physically be able to get onto the lanes if they want to. I think, again, not in the master plan, but in Mr. Axon's evidence, may have been his rebuttal proof, in fact, might have been before, will impose criminal sanctions. There'll be a number plate recognition system set up, and if you go up there, you'll get fined. Do you accept that as a likely effective measure to deter vehicles from going onto the lanes?
I think that the difficulty you have there with regard to, let's just say, prohibition of turning, that's what the point is. The police will not enforce that. Unfortunately, it is a low priority, so there will be a level of abuse. The local highway authority does not have the power to enforce that sort of matter. Whilst we can enforce bus lanes, this is not a bus lane. So there is no way that the highway authority is able to enforce something that should be picked up as part of the master planning process to negate against this happening in the first place.
Right. So that's vehicles on lanes. Let's just turn our attention to the bridge, which is obviously for one of the routes in and out of the site for pedestrians and cyclists. Part of that route, if you go out the northeastern side of the site in an easterly direction, you'll end up on the B lane bridge. What's proposed there is an exercise of trying to separate cyclists and pedestrians from vehicular traffic by physical means, perhaps some bollards. What do you say about the acceptability of proposals and the safety of arrangements on B lane bridge, given the intended use of that for increased numbers of pedestrians and cyclists?
I have concerns of significance, as highlighted in my proof of evidence. I have read all the documentation, the safety audit that was produced, but I look at this from a user perspective. I'm looking at this from a safety perspective. I think the starting point is what is highlighted, that road width protected by, let's just say, plastic bollards, I think also known as wands, is 4.1 metres. That is only really suitable for 2 medium-sized cars to pass each other safely. Doesn't have regard to anything bigger than 2 reasonable-sized cars. For example, 2 4x4s would not be able to pass. So that's the first point. And then somebody's got to give way. And the question is, who gives way? And you've got aggressive drivers, unfortunately, on the network, and not everybody will want to give way. Not everybody will appreciate what happens on the bridge. So therefore, there will be a level of reversing required. As these bollards are, I think as proposed, are going to be plastic ones, they can easily be damaged by manoeuvring vehicles. It may be the case that a vehicle needs to negotiate and move from a vehicle coming in the opposing direction. Plastic ones are passive, they're meant to brake. that in itself could create problems for pedestrians who are using the footway. Using the wands themselves, those bollards, doesn't prevent a cyclist from encroaching into a footway, and in reality it's about separating movements, but in this case that isn't always possible. What also hasn't been fully considered is how the bridge is going to be protected from an impact. Whilst I know in the safety audit it's highlighted, well, that is a limited risk, but in reality, since we've got a very narrow road width available, that risk, if there is an issue, will be significant.
Okay.
In addition to that, what we also have, whilst we've got 4.1 metres available, and whilst we have bollards in place, the effective width is going to be less than 4.1. In a normal situation where you've got curbs, a vehicle potentially could run up to the curbs knowing he's not going to damage his vehicle, whereas if you've got bollards, a vehicle wants to protect its own vehicle and try to move away from the bollards, well, some will, reducing that effective width from 4.1. So again, that creates a problem. If you're a cyclist on the network, having regard to the guidance, having half a metre away from, we'll say, the footway, 0.75 away from the footway, and 1.5 metres from the safe distance to a moving car, doesn't really give any movement for anything more than a small car in the opposing direction,
All right.
without impeding upon safety. The list is quite endless.
Mr. Stevens, the appellants will say that B Lane Bridge currently operates perfectly well, as does the bridge at Flag Lane and indeed a bridge at Coot Lane. And Mr. Axon's got experience of another bridge elsewhere in the country which operates perfectly well with lots of people going to and fro. Do any of those points provide you with comfort in terms of the likely safe operation of the B Lane Bridge? And if they don't, explain why.
No. You've got to look at each bridge in its own context, in its own location. In this particular case, B Lane Bridge is going to be a key desire line for pedestrians and cyclists leaving the site. And people of all ages, maybe people who have mobility impairments. Consider that with the photographs that have been provided in the, I think it's in, I'm not sure if it's the proof of evidence or the rebuttal highlights a different area. That route is there for leisure purposes. It's not people with prams. It's not with local cyclists and children. The Coot Lane, Trainhouse Lane bridge, that is rurally located, again, where you don't have high levels of local users from the built environment. So we're not comparing like for like.
All right. Can I just ask you one or two things about the Crossborough Link Road? Your evidence refers to the fact, and it's been referred to by another witness on behalf of the council, that there's no assurance within the master plan and infrastructure delivery information that the remaining section of the Crossborough Link Road will be provided.
Yes.
In terms of the completion of that project, what difference would completion of the Crossborough Link Road make in terms of the temptation for some drivers to use the lanes?
Well, it removes that temptation away. It puts them on the road which is then suitable for those types of movement. Also encourages more sustainability.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you've got a route which is lightly trafficked, and let's just say it's late in an evening, people may, for personal safety reasons, may not use it. However, if it's a corridor which has a good level of traffic on it, they will feel safer to actually use that corridor, i.e. when we've got the Crossborough Link Road in place with New Bridge, it will be used by a proportion of vehicles from this site, and it's active, will also then support the use by pedestrians and cyclists.
Okay. Two other aspects of the scheme that the appellants say will keep, or at least contribute to keeping residents out of their cars. The first is a local centre that we're told could contain facilities such as a shop, something called a mobility hub, and space for working, amongst other things, potentially. Do you accept that that provision is likely to make a significant difference in encouraging people out of their cars in this location?
What's been offered is slightly better than a travel plan. I think it is encouraged, it is supported, but it's not going to have an impact of significance now.
Why do you say that?
I mean, for example, you could hire an electric bike, for example. But if I was wanted to use an electric bike for my journey to work from that site, the way it's presented at the moment, I would then have to go to the mobility centre, hope that it's open, assume it's open because I want to get to work for 7:30 in the morning, get the bike, and then get to work. Whereas a normal travel plan would have a push bike available at the dwelling, therefore making it slightly more convenient to use the bike that's been provided as part of the travel plan rather than using the mobility centre to hire an electric bike. I think the electric bike idea is great, okay for leisure purposes, but you couldn't really use the electric bikes for shopping or other purposes. It has very limited value, but it is supported.
And then the last aspect that I want to mention in terms of trying to keep people out of cars is public transport. The appellants intend the site to be served by buses. What do you currently know about the detail of any bus service that is proposed for the site?
At this stage, there is no certainty of what's been provided. I'm not sure what's happening with regard to routing. I think early on in the process, it was in and out via the A582, and I think since then they're trying to promote the use of the lanes, accessing other routes. But the problem I've got is one of sustainability once the pump priming has been removed. Also, what happens for the first 50 units which are built on the western side of the site when there is no public transport available? I think from my perspective, accessing, and I've seen something about using a click service which isn't operated, that's more appropriate to rural locations. Having a direct service from the 582 can only go to one destination, Preston. That only has a very limited target audience. So in reality, from a public transport perspective, don't forget this site is circa 800 metres by 1200 metres. Everybody, or a high proportion, will have to walk to the services that are provided within Kingsfold, but also on Leyland Road.
All right. I think, Mr. Stevens, that probably completes the list of things that I needed to ask you about. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I suggest we take a short break. How long do you think will you need any more than 10 or 15 minutes to prepare?
How long does it take to make a cup of tea and drink it? So why don't we have 20 and go wild? So.
Okay, 20 minutes it is then, if that suits everybody else. That will also allow me, because right at the end of that examination in chief, my computer decided to die and has removed everything from the screen that I needed. So I'll have 20 minutes to reload it all.
This is any of your computers.
Yes.
Okay, we'll come back at 10 to 4 then. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
sir.
you very much indeed, sir. There was a picture in the
Sounds a bit like
Times.
Wigan,
There was a
doesn't
picture in the Times this morning. I looked at the picture and I thought, what on earth is going on there? And I read the caption. It was the Lancashire hosted the global gravy wrestling competition.
Only in Lancashire.
I know. Only in Lancashire.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for the microphones. That's it. Good. We can all hear each other now, I hope. It's 3:50. Time to resume, and we now move to cross-examination of Mr. Stevens' evidence. So, Mr. Gatkowski.
Thank you very much indeed. So good afternoon, Mr. Stevens. We were reminiscing just now about when we previously met. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Right, I'm going to take my jacket off because it's getting a bit close
Please
in here,
do.
forgive me. Now, Mr. Stevens, as you'll know, two of the reasons for refusal, numbers 1 and 2, specifically mention severe adverse impact on the local highway network. You'll recall that, I'm sure. And that obviously is a link to paragraph 111 of the framework. So I wonder if we can just go to paragraph 111 of the framework, please. And just by way of preface, my first tranche of questions will be about whether there is or whether there would or wouldn't be a severe adverse impact, and then after that we're going to turn to whether or not there would be an unacceptable impact on highway safety. So we're doing the severe impact bit first. That will take us into tomorrow morning, I suspect. Anyway, so starting with severe, as we know, we're told in 111 of the framework, development should only be refused on highways grounds if ... the residual cumulative impacts on the road network would be severe. Now, that word severe, as we know, Mr. Stevens, do you agree, doesn't have in either the framework or the PPG guidance, doesn't have, if you like, a technical meaning. It's not there isn't a mechanistic threshold. You can't just look for a magic sort of number, if you like, and say, therefore, it's severe, can you?
I accept that, yes.
So it's not a term of art, in other words. It's just a word. It's just a word of the English language. Now, if you look up the word severe in the Oxford English Dictionary, we're told it means very great. Is that an approach that you would accept? Just the ordinary English meaning of the word severe?
I think it can be a term that could be attributed to it,
Yeah,
but in
okay.
some ways you've also got to have regard to all other aspects. So it's how you define your own definition. So I'm happy to support that,
Right.
but it's then about context.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure what that means. At the moment, we're just trying to work out when the government tells us, or, forgive me, advises the inspector, and presumably the Secretary of State will apply his own policy in due course when he makes his decision, that one should only turn something down if there would be a severe impact, by which it can only mean adverse impact, by the way, so severe adverse impact. We're just trying to work out, well, how have we gone about working out whether something would be severe or not? So I'm suggesting to you that we do no more, though less, and treat it as a word in the English, word of the English language. It means very great, and we need to then make a judgment call as to whether the impacts in this case would be very great, open bracket severe.
Okay,
Is that okay by you?
I can accept that.
Okay, good. Right. Now we know in this case that Vectos, Mr. Axon's firm, have utilised a microsimulation model, as you were explaining in your evidence in chief. It's called Paramics, P-A-R-A-M-I-C-S, Paramics. And as we know, and as you went through in your evidence in chief, the output of the model, which has been reported in the TA and in Mr. Axon's proof and rebuttal, is shown in journey times, isn't it? So you take various routes, there are 7 of them, aren't there, as you indicated, and you look at how long it would take you to get from one end to the other in a future year, with and without the development that we propose. That's the basic gist of the work that's been done, isn't it?
That was the approach
Yes.
that Mr. Axon has taken.
That's the approach he's taken. Now, I know you've criticised pretty much all of the inputs that went into that work, and I'm going to ask you about some of those in due course. But what I want to do, please, is just get our bearings, because obviously the inspector here, and in due course the Secretary of State, will have to work out whether Mr. Axon whether it's right for Mr. Axon to regard his work as giving one a fair understanding of, a sound understanding of what's likely to happen in the future or not. And there must be at least a prospect. Let's put it no higher than that. You never know. The inspector and or the Secretary of State might think Mr. Axon's got some things right, as opposed to your criticism of pretty much everything that he's done. So what I want to do is just come to where Mr. Axon, has ended up. The convenient place to find this is in his rebuttal. And in his rebuttal, I would like you, please, to go to page 23. And when you've got it, if you can have two documents open, rather than using the electronic version of the TA as the inspector's been and I've been, there's a diagram which is found in Mr. Axon's proof, in his proof, which is, just give me one moment. Hold on. If I was looking at his proof rather than his rebuttal, that would help me a lot. In Mr. Axon's proof, if you could go to page, my notes saying me page 54. Yes, that's where we're going to start. So if we can have open page 54 of his proof, that shows the red route, which is one of the 7 that's been modelled, and you'll know this is the A582 from, I understand, from Golden Way, the A59 through to Junction 29 of the M6. All right, have you got that?
No,
there?
I'm struggling with page 54. It's a table.
Of his proof.
Yes.
Right. Of Mr. Axon's
Oh, sorry, proof rather than... I apologise.
No, that's all right. I'm using the proof because it's easier to navigate, because I know the inspector's got a hard copy of it, so we could find it in the TA, but it would take us till tomorrow morning to find the page. I'm going to start with what's been called Route A. All right, are you? No, just don't worry. Tell me when you're there. We'll be fine.
Okay, I've got page 54.
Okay, so that's a route which I'm going to ask you some questions about first of all. Do you see?
Okay.
So that's why we've got page 54. So we've got an aid memoir as to what it is that this is Route A, what it is that we're discussing over these next few moments. Now, in his rebuttal, he explains in his paragraph 1.90 that the microsimulation model has been rerun, optimising the junction signal settings. Do you remember that being explained? And then if we turn over in his proof to page 24, we see the situation in the future year that he's used. I know it's not the one you've used, but in the future year he's used, he shows in those two figures the difference between the reference case, so that's the future without our development, and the development case, the future with our development, in minutes in terms of journey times, broken down obviously into the various hours which are shown. And we've got northbound at the top of page 24, and we've got southbound at the bottom of page 24. And in his rebuttal, a little bit later on, he then, if you like, explains that information. I mean, it can be seen pretty much at a glance, but he explains the information in his rebuttal at a paragraph that begins at page 25, paragraph 1.92. And the bit that we want is over the page in particular at 1.92 on page 26, sub 3. All right, so this is his, if you've got that, this is him explaining that, what we can see on the figures that we were looking at just now. And he says on that corridor, the effect of the development is that journey times remain within plus or minus 1 minute for 8 hours of the 12 hours modelled on the northbound route, and for 5 hours of the 12 hours modelled on the southbound route. In the morning busiest hour, the modelled change in journey time is 1 minute 52 seconds northbound, 2 minutes 43 seconds southbound. Now I'm just going to ask you, if you want to make a little note of something. You can see it on the figures, but if we take that first, in the morning busiest hour, the model change in journey times is 1 minute 52 seconds northbound. That is from 13 minutes 15 seconds to 15 minutes and 7 seconds. All right, so that is what this modelling is reporting. It would take you that extra 1 minute 52 seconds, but in terms of the underlying position, that's from just over 13 minutes to just over 15 minutes, to put it shortly. And then I'm going to collect this data and I'm going to ask you a question. And 2 minutes 43 seconds southbound. So again, the figures for that are, it would go from 15 minutes 20 seconds, 15 minutes 20 seconds to 18 minutes and 3 seconds. All right? All right. And then he says, in the evening busiest hour, the model changes 2 minutes 20 seconds northbound. So that's from 18 minutes 42 seconds to 21 minutes and 3 seconds. So 18 minutes 42 seconds to 21 minutes and 3 seconds. And then finally, and we'll get to the question, 2 minutes 7 seconds southbound. This is in the evening peak, and that is from 17 minutes 56 seconds to 20 minutes and 3 seconds. 17:56 to 20:03. All right, so those are the numbers which one gets from the graphs, which obviously are then based on the data which has been read to give those minutes and seconds. Right, so just bearing in mind, of course, these are what's been stated in that paragraph are the worst increases. They're the peak hours, and he's explained that for most of the day, where are we, for most of the day northbound, it's less than a minute, plus or minus a minute, and for getting on for half the day southbound, it's the same, similar thing. So he's reported the worst case instances. Now, what I would like to know, Mr. Stevens, is this. I appreciate you don't accept the build-up that has gone into producing these numbers, but let us just assume, for the sake of the question, that the work that's been done to produce these numbers is reliable. It's good enough to be relied on to make a judgment, let's put it like that. Are you or are you not saying to the Inspector and the Secretary of State that increases in the peak hours of, what is it, less than the time to listen to one song on your radio, for example, the increases of, just under 2 minutes in the worst case, just under 3 minutes, just over 2 minutes, that those increases on journeys which are already 13 minutes, 15 minutes, 18 minutes, that those increases would be correctly and aptly described as severe, in the sense of being very great in terms of their impact?
I would say yes.
You would say
the
yes.
reason why is we're looking at that long corridor that's highlighted in red, of which includes that initial coming from the north, good section of dualling where we don't have any congestion issues, going all the way down to the tank roundabout, where the route then goes eastbound, no conditions, so no issues of congestion. It's only a few locations, as highlighted through examination in chief, where we've got those levels of increase. So it's slightly misleading to say, actually as a corridor as a whole, that because there are only increases in 2 to 3 minutes, that isn't severe, when it's biased by a high proportion of that journey length where there is no congestion. So in some ways, I am right by saying what we need to look at is not journey times. We need to look.
That's not the question I'm asking at the moment. I appreciate you don't accept journey times. I'm asking you, what if the Inspector of the Secretary of State thinks, let's just apply some, dare I say it, common sense here, that if you're a driver or a passenger in a car, congestion, fine, you might get yourself very agitated about it, but what actually might register with you is my journey taking substantially longer or not? That might not be a bad way in common sense terms, in ordinary behavioural terms, to assess the situation, mightn't it, Mr. Stevens? It's got to be a relevant way, hasn't it, of assessing matters to see whether journeys would take longer, or do you say it's irrelevant?
I think it is a component which goes into the equation. However,
Okay.
it's not the only component.
Right, so it's relevant and it's something which can therefore, and as a component, as you've just indicated, should therefore be looked at? Yes?
It could. It is one approach.
Yes.
If you then take the approach
Right.
that's generally used for development, we have regard to the key locations where congestion
And I'm going to ask you all
occurs.
about your junction, your individual junction modelling. Don't worry, we've got quite a long time on that coming, but I'm starting with Mr. Axon, and I want to get our bearings on this. Now, what about those, and it's most of the day for the northbound, and it's almost half the day for the southbound, when the differences are in the order of a minute. Are you saying that those are severe impacts as well?
It highlights there is a level of variability
Yes.
on the corridor.
Are you saying those are
However,
severe impacts, Mr. Stevens?
If we could just continue on the point
As
I was
long as you
making.
answer my question, yes.
Whilst there is variability on the network, you've got to have regard to the section of the corridor that is congested, rather than biasing the results
No,
for a
Mr.
longer
Stevens,
length of
that is
corridor.
answering a different question. So I'm asking you about the route which has been, and there are 7 of them, we're going to look at them in turn.
Okay.
I'm asking you about the route, and we just started with the first one that has been used. It's from, top end to bottom end, or bottom end to top end, depending on the direction of travel. And the micro-simulation model charts it all out, and this is the results. These are the results that come out of the micro-simulation model. So can we just go, I understand you say we should concentrate on the hot spots, if you like, or the pinch points, I think you said in chief. I'm going to talk to you about all of that later on. At the moment, I'm asking you about what Mr. Axon's done. So, if the Inspector of the Secretary of State thinks it's relevant to look at these routes and that journey times are relevant to be considered, you've told me already that you think that an increase on a journey that's currently taking just over 13 minutes to a journey it would take just over 15 minutes, you've told me already that's severe, right? And I was asking you about most of the day in one direction and nearly half of the day in the other direction, when the difference is about a minute. And I was simply asking you whether in those hours, which make up the most of the day, in those hours you're saying that increases of that nature constitutes a severe impact. A minute, it's taken me far longer than that to ask you the question. Has that had a severe impact on our lives, I wonder?
As you said, there's a level of variability in the network. I think a key component was...
So is that therefore, so I'd like an answer to the question. So therefore they're not severe impacts. Although the majority of the day, when the change is a minute or so, that's not a severe impact.
I will accept that.
Right.
However,
Okay.
there is that variability, and there becomes a point where it goes actually from a level of delay to a further level of delay. I think one important point is, whilst you're highlighting journey time, but it's about the experience on that corridor, but also we haven't indicated really what that corridor length is. We haven't considered what the vehicle speeds are, because if it's that corridor length is 30 kilometres, and therefore the vehicle speeds are much higher than what has been reported on in Mr. Axon's evidence, and as I've highlighted in my proof, where vehicle speeds on their 582 are sub 10 miles an hour.
Yes, so that's the situation without the development, because in your proof what you do is you say that speeds are low, or they would be low in the future, if you take this approach. Without the development, you add the development and they become a bit lower still. But can you point me to where you deal with this in your proof? I know you've dealt with this in your proof, and the changes are I mean, they're very small in terms of the actual speed per hour.
But it's also having regard to the starting point.
Yeah, let's just start with this. Let's just take them one by one, if we may,
Okay.
Mr. Stevens. So, because you're the chap who's mentioned this point, so I know you deal with this in your proof. Can you just remind me, or was it in your rebuttal? Just remind me where it is. It's in your proof. I think.
It's in my proof, yes.
Yeah. If you'd be so kind.
If we can go to page 44.
44. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Yes, here we are. So now, have you got route A on this? In this one here, are any of these the route that we've just been discussing? Forgive me.
In the transport assessment, it's
Yes.
broken down into 7 routes,
Yes,
where
I
this
know.
is an amalgamation of 2 routes.
And 2 of them have been amalgamated to make route A. You're right. So forgive me. Are any of these the amalgam of what's become route A?
No.
No. Okay, all right. Well, while we've got the page, I mean, these are for other routes, but we'll come to later. But we have, for example, where are we in your text on page 44? Paragraph 4.1.83, you've got, without development, have you got this, a speed of 7.6 miles per hour?
That is correct.
And then with the development, that goes to 6.5, so a mile per hour slower. And that to you is a severe impact, is it?
And this, yes.
Right,
The reason,
okay.
can I
Thank
just
you.
substantiate that, please?
I'm just trying to collect these up together, and then we're going to come to how you.
Well, I think the witness wants to explain why he reaches the conclusion on
Well, I was
severe
going to ask
impact.
him in a few moments' time, if you forgive me. Can we
As
just
long
get
as
can we
you
just
come
get the
back to it,
next
yeah.
one, and then I will come back to it. 4.1.84. Oh no, that's a different point, isn't it? So no, you then move on to different point. Okay, well let's take 4.1.83. So they're already going, well, without us in the future, forgive me, they'd be going at just over 7.5 miles per hour, and with us they'd be going at 6.5 miles per hour on this modelling, and you think that's severe, and you're about to explain why that change of 1 mile per hour is quote unquote very great. Why is that?
Right, the starting point is this is a primary road. It is an A road that is meant for more strategic movements. It has a speed limit of 50 miles an hour, and that's what vehicles would like to travel at.
Yes.
It's 7.6 miles an hour to travel at 4 kilometres, and this particular section is the east-west section of the A582. That's from the tank roundabout all the way through to the motorway. 7.6 miles an hour is not what's considered a speed that should be that should be reasonable for a road of that classification.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, if we can continue, that is one of the reasons why the authority is looking to make improvements on that corridor, because the starting point is so incredibly low. Any reduction from that can only make matters worse, therefore considered severe.
Well, that's the rub, you see, that's the point. So without us, traffic in the future on this modelling would be driving along that stretch at an average, this is in the peak hours, at the average of 7.6 miles an hour. And you say, well, that's very slow compared to a speed limit of 50 miles an hour. It's obviously way below 50 miles an hour. You and I can see that. That's without us. Then we come along and it drops a mile per hour. And you say, well, that can only make matters worse. All right, well, you're going a mile per hour slower than you were in the world without us. But it's that last bit, and therefore you said that's severe. Well, it's not. I mean, in no use of the English language can a change of 1 mile an hour on a journey which is already in your book slow, in no way can a drop of 1 mile per hour be regarded as very great. It's a severe impact.
I would disagree, because the starting point is so incredibly low.
Well, the impact is the difference between 7.6 and 50 miles an hour might or might not be a very great difference. But what we're actually talking about is the impact of the development. And so if you focus on the difference between 7.6 miles an hour and 6.5, would you still say that that difference itself of a mile per hour is a very great impact?
I would say so.
Right, okay. Well, this is just giving us an insight, Mr. Stevens, into the way you approach matters. All right. And so if we go back to the journey times, because you took me on this diversion, if you like, to speeds, but if we go back to the journey times we were looking at, Mr. Axon's rebuttal at page 26. So you've told me that for all of those hours when the difference is about a minute, that's not severe, and you've told me for all of those hours which I've picked out, where it's not hours, for all of those, yes, it is the hours actually, for the peak hours. For those peak hours where the differences aren't a minute, they're a bit under 2 minutes, a bit over 2 minutes, a bit over 2 minutes, and one of them is 2 minutes 43 seconds. You've told me all of those are severe. So that's telling me that in your mind's eye, you've got something in your mind's eye that's thinking, well, a minute thereabouts, that's okay, that's not severe, but a couple of minutes is severe. Now, where's the line in the sand, Mr. Stevens? Where's the threshold then?
From my perspective, I traversed this corridor on many occasions, during peaks and off peaks. Whilst I cannot substantiate the timings that have been recorded, have been modelled, I know it links back to the microsim and the validation data that was collected. Off peak, that network has a reasonable level of reliability. I know during the peaks, that certainly that east-west section where no improvements have been provided, unlike the north-south, when you get to that evening peak, which is extended, that journey time and those vehicle speeds are significant. And in some ways, as an extension to that, it's the quality of the journey and what is memorable about that journey. And it's actually the key point are the junctions and not necessarily what happens in between the junctions.
Now, we're going to come to the junction modelling later, Mr. Stevens, as I keep saying. But I'm asking you about these journey times as reported here. So, forgive me, I'm not entirely sure I had an answer to my question, to be honest, because I know I didn't. So, we had a minute or so, that's not severe. We've got a bit under 2 minutes is severe, a bit over 2 minutes is severe, and I suppose logically, therefore, in your book, just under 3 minutes, 2 minutes 43 seconds is severe. So let's just think about somewhere in between a minute and a minute 52 seconds, we've crossed the Rubicon from not being severe into being severe. Where in your mind's eye is this break point between the impact not being very great and it being very great?
In some ways, I'll have to refer back to my previous answer. I've traversed this network during the peak and the off-peak. Off-peak, I don't see there to be an issue.
Yes.
During the peak, there is a significant level of traffic. There is huge levels of delay.
I'm asking you about these
So
journey times here, please.
Yeah, with regard to the journey times, I cannot substantiate those journey times.
No, that's again not what I'm asking you. Forgive me, I really don't care whether you can substantiate them or not. This is the modelling that's been done. Mr. Axon will defend it if he wishes to do so, I'm sure he will. I'm just asking you about a possible outcome, which is that you never know, the inspector, the Secretary of State might actually think this modelling is good enough to be relied on to make a judgment call. If they do, I'm asking you a simple question, which is we know a minute isn't severe, and we know in your book the lowest of them is a minute 52 seconds is severe. So I'm just thinking to myself, there must somewhere therefore be a line in your mind's eye between severe and not severe. And I'm just asking you a very simple question. Where is that, Mr. Stevens? It's very simple. Where is it?
It is a question that's been posed, but
Yes.
it's not possible to be able to answer that
Right.
with a level of reliability having regard to simple journey times when we've got a network of which, for most of the time, it is free flow conditions. That's why when we're looking at journey times, you need to link that back to the length of the corridor. If you do that, it then links back to vehicle speeds.
I'm asking you about this corridor. This is the one that's, this route is the route I'm asking you about. We've got the reported journey times. So, I mean, can we proceed on the basis that you either are refusing to indicate where you think the line is between severe and not severe in this instance, or Well, you don't know, but you've been able to say one is severe and the other isn't severe. I mean, which of those is it?
I've been very clear on my answer.
No, you haven't. Not in answer to my
yes,
question, you haven't, Mr.
I believe I've been
Stevens.
very clear on my answer.
No, you've
and
evaded
it is,
answering
no,
the question.
and it is, you cannot just consider whether something is purely, I said it's one component of many.
No,
Looking
I'm asking you
yeah,
about this
no,
one component. Forgive me, I'm going to interrupt you. Please don't keep telling me there are all sorts of other things. I know in your book there are all sorts of other things. I'm going to ask you about some of them. At the moment, I'm asking you about this thing, because the work that's been done on this side of the room is put forward in terms of journey times. And our approach is very simple, and we hope commonsensical, which is that these increases in journey times aren't severe. So you take a different point of view. Fine, I'm exploring that. And for you to be able to say, that's not severe, this is severe, can only mean that logically you have a position in your mind's eye where you can discriminate between severe and not severe. How are you doing it, Mr. Stevens? That's what I want to understand for these journey times, because you told me a minute not severe, a minute 52 severe. So how are you doing that, Mr. Stevens?
When I looked at all this analysis, I converted those journey times, which I think in isolation are meaningless, to
Right.
vehicle speeds.
Right.
And
Journey times are meaningless.
From vehicle speeds, you get a greater understanding of what the quality of that journey is to individual drivers.
Meaningless. Okay. So the journey times are meaningless, right?
In isolation, yes. That's why it's having regard to the vehicle speeds which
Right.
a vehicle would use on that corridor.
And have you...
As I indicated, if that corridor was double in length, 13 minutes to 15 minutes, it's still a difference of 2 minutes. If it was half that
Yes.
distance, those vehicle speeds would be much lower. And there's got to be a point where actually the starting point is incredibly low, and that's the point I think highlighted 3 times now.
Yeah, well, you've said all sorts of things over and over, but never answered my question. So journey times are meaningless. So on that basis, then, are you saying that you simply can't? Because you agreed with me a while ago, Mr. Stevens, that journey times are relevant in terms of assessing whether the impact would be severe or not severe. I mean, I remember that clearly from a few minutes ago. So many minutes ago, we were up and down this road several times over, I think, by now. But anyway, I remember it clearly. So are you now saying that journey times aren't relevant to assessing?
As I said, it's a component.
Right, it's a component. So I've asked you about that component, but in relation to that component, you've told me journey times are meaningless.
In isolation.
So they're not meaningless if they are taken along with journey speeds.
And also
Is that right?
And queue lengths.
Don't give me the
queue-
and, just answer the first point. If you want to add to it, you can, but let me have a direct answer first. So journey times plus vehicle speeds are meaningful.
That starts to show a picture.
Right? Are they
Of what
meaningful?
impacts.
Are they meaningful in terms of working out whether an impact would be severe?
Together with other information such as queue length at pinch points.
Oh, well, that's your individual modelling, isn't it? Your junction modelling, which we're going to come to.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, journey times, vehicle speeds. Let's move to that then. So, for the journey times which were reported in this sub-paragraph that we've been looking at on page 26 of Mr. Axton's rebuttal, paragraph 1.92 sub 3, you haven't, I don't think, reduced the vehicle times for this. Have change in vehicle speeds, forgive me, have you?
That hasn't been my approach. I've been
Well, you
looking-
just told me just now that if you're going to look at, you saying you've got to look at vehicle speeds, and in your proof, as you'll remember, but for a different route, you did look at vehicle speeds, and you told me a change of 1 mile per hour is a severe impact.
This is based upon the evidence that Mr. Axton has presented.
Yes.
My approach is different. My approach is the approach that is used within the industry, looking at the key pinch points, because
Well-
at those locations, that's why you need to look at the residual
Yep.
impacts as
Yep.
per the MPPF. Looking at vehicle speeds and looking at journey times, you'll never get to a point that is something that you can say consider as severe
Really? Well, you've just told me earlier on that you
in
can.
isolation. That's
Wait.
why
Well,
you need
now-
to include
now
it with
I'm
all
very-
the other aspects.
Now I'm very confused. So wait a minute. You told me earlier on that just looking at journey times, there are specific journey times where the change would be severe. You told me earlier on that the change in vehicle speeds, you remember that instance, the example we looked at page
Yep.
44 of your proof, the 1 mile an hour slower, was severe, and now you've told me that you would never get to a position of severe if you just looked at journey times and vehicle speed. So which is it, Mr. Stevens? Please don't dance around. Those answers are completely inconsistent with each other.
No, they're not. They're very
Of course they
consistent.
are.
It's about, as I highlighted, it's about all the components.
No,
To
no,
be
no,
able
no.
to give a clear understanding of what the impacts are
No, Mr.
along that
Stevens.
corridor and at key locations on that corridor.
No, Mr. Stevens. If that's right, and you've said it several times that that's how you see it, if that's right, then when you told me earlier on that a change of X minutes to Y minutes for certain peak hour journeys was a severe impact, that a change of 1 mile an hour in vehicle speeds was a severe impact, that can't have been right in your approach, because in your approach you're telling me that you can't really make those judgment calls based on journey times and vehicle speeds. So should we delete all of that stuff about severe?
No, as I've highlighted,
Right.
3 or 4 times out, it's
Yeah,
about
okay.
looking at all those components, not in isolation, but together.
No, but I'm looking at them in isolation, step by step with you, Mr. Stevens, because if we just fudge it all together, it's very hard to actually, grab the rabbit by its ankles before it dives down the hole. We just need to look at them step by step to try and get our heads around what's going on. So journey times in isolation, are those changes that are reported in Mr. Axon's rebuttal, looked at in isolation, would you say they're severe? The ones in the peak hours. In isolation, now I've understood what you're saying, I think. In isolation, are they severe or not?
In isolation, those journey times says very little about...
Are they severe or not, Mr. Stevens?
It's not possible to indicate.
Well, you did earlier
No,
on. You
it's
told
not.
me.
The reason why we don't have the full information regarding the corridor,
Right, so they're not severe.
that's your interpretation.
No, I'm just asking you the question. Look, they're either severe or they're not severe. It's kind of binary, really. And because we know the threshold in the framework is severe. So I'm just trying to make sense of this, Mr. Stevens. To be honest, I really don't care what the answers are because, I just want some clear answers. So, you told me earlier on, and I thought we were looking at the journey times in isolation, that's the way I put it to you, that those journey time changes in the peak hours were severe. You've now told me that you can't look at it in isolation because you can never get to a position of severe impact if you just look at journey time. So if I ask you again, just looking at the journey times, are those journey time changes on page 26, 1.92, sub 3, in the peak hours, are they severe impacts in isolation or not?
In isolation, you cannot make that judgment.
Right.
As I've highlighted on a few occasions,
Thank you.
when I looked at those journey time differences, as highlighted in my own proof of evidence,
Thank you.
I have changed that into miles per hour to get a clear understanding of what the impacts are and what the quality of that experience to a user would be.
Right, okay, so we've done journey times for this particular route. I'm so delighted there are 7 of these routes, but we've done journey times for this particular route and I've now got a clear answer. I thought you hadn't converted this one into miles per hour vehicle speeds. If you have, then can you just show me where it is? Sorry, if I've missed it, that's my fault, of course.
For which?
For this route that we're talking about, Route A.
Well, in the transport assessment, they only considered part of the route. So that's all that I've considered, and that was obviously highlighted
No.
in the transport assessment table 7.3.
No, Route A, forgive me, is the amalgam of 2 of the routes,
Yep.
2 of the 7 routes. So have you not got have you reported in your proof, gosh, why is it such hard work? Have you reported in your proof a change in miles per hour for this route or in your rebuttal for this route?
For the totality, no.
No, okay. Have you done it for the 2 constituent elements that have gone to make up this route?
I've only looked at the one element as highlighted in table 7.3 of the TA.
Yeah, and where is that in your proof? Forgive me, that wasn't your...
That was the 4.83.
That was a
4.1.
4.1, that's a change of 1 mile per hour. Right,
Yeah.
okay, fine. So for a part of what's now become Route A, there's a change of 1 mile an hour. And just like with the journey times, looked at in isolation, are you saying that driving 1 mile an hour slower is a severe impact in this situation that we're talking about? in isolation, is that a severe impact?
In isolation, I would say the answer is yes. To qualify
1
that,
mile an hour
if
is
I can
severe.
qualify that,
Yes.
if the average speed was 49 miles an hour, then reducing to 48, I would say that wouldn't be severe. The starting point is 7.6 miles an hour.
Yep.
That's bordering on running speed,
Right.
jogging speed,
So
as
that's-
being reliable. A reduction from that cannot be considered reasonable, having journey reliability
That's not the
on
question.
the corridor.
That's not the question. The question isn't whether a reduction from a slightly speedier jog to a slightly less speedy jog is reasonable. That's not the question. The question is whether the impact, and here it's the impact of the development, because we're asking ourselves, are we going to grant permission for the development or refuse permission for the development, whether the impact, which here is a 1 mile an hour on a base which is 6.6 miles an hour, so you reduce it to 6.5 miles an hour, is that a severe impact? Now, so you're making a slow speed a bit slower. That doesn't sound like a severe impact to me, Mr. Stevens. Is it a severe impact to you? In isolation, it's already slow compared to the 50 miles an hour. It becomes a tad slower. I mean, it'd be barely perceptible. Barely perceptible. No one would know if they were driving a mile an hour slower.
But don't forget,
Is that severe?
Yes.
Right.
The reason why, don't forget, this is over a corridor in length, and this is going through a number of junctions. Would they notice it's slower as they're queuing up for a longer period of time in between junctions? The answer is yes. The quality of that journey is poor, then gets worse with development. The starting point is the corridor, as highlighted in the modelling results, is operating above theoretical capacities.
That's all your individual junction modelling, which we must be very careful not to mix these things in, to be quite frank, because you can't do that, as we're going to see. But and I've promised you many times over, we're going to look at your individual junction modelling. I'm just looking at what we've got here from Mr. Axon first of all, because we've got to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, can we just go back to this, please? You said difference of a mile per hour, severe because, and you then went on to explain, because people would be tackling these more and more congested junctions. That in a way is where the rot sits in, I think. If we just go back to my question, I mean, frankly, you might or might not notice increased queues. We're going to look at your junction analysis later on for that, or tomorrow for that. But this 1 mile per hour point that you've made in your evidence, your written evidence, nobody would be aware that they're travelling a mile per hour slower, will they?
This is
itself, the vehicle speed in itself, it's not going to be perceptible, is it? A difference of a mile per hour is not going to be perceptible.
It would, because this all relates to where you are in the queue, in a stationary queue. If I can just highlight...
But that's the queuing point. I'm
no,
asking you
can I
about,
also bring you back?
No.
Oh, sorry, I'm trying to make my point.
You are, but not in relation to the question I've asked you, which is about the vehicle speed itself. Every time I try to pin you down on a particular point, you then take me on a diversion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm asking you about the vehicle speed itself, and I've put to you that the vehicle speed itself, if you said to somebody in a car, right, you know, I'm going to now tell you we're driving at 7.6 miles an hour, and I'm now going to tell you we're driving at 6.5 miles per hour, that difference of a mile per hour wouldn't really be perceptible to somebody. There might be other things which are perceptible, such as a queue is a bit longer or whatever it might be, but the vehicle speed itself, that change, isn't going to be perceptible, is it?
I would disagree, because where you are located in that queue
Right.
is
Okay.
further back. Can I just continue with my point, please?
Well, that's... But
Please,
you're
can I continue with my point?
You're coming to queues, and they're the result of your modelling, and we're going to look at your models.
Yeah, but could I just make the point, since we're talking about speeds and that starting point of difference, can I just take you back to the MPPF 110, subsection D, any significant impacts from the development on the transport corridor in terms of capacity and congestion, that doesn't say vehicle time, congestion, where on the highway safety can be cost effective mitigated to an acceptable degree.
Right.
The approach that's been taken forward, purely looking at journey time, does not. You cannot link that back to
You see, Mr. Stevens,
capacity
this is where you're not
or
answering my
congestion.
questions. Forgive me, this is where this is just diversionary tactics on your part. I'm asking you because we've got to break the evidence down and look at it step by step. What we've done is reporting in Mr. Axon's work. We've looked particularly at journey times. We've been discussing those. I know you don't accept the approach. I've got all of that. We're going to look at your approach, I promise you. But as I've said several times over, we've got to allow for the possibility that someone actually might agree with us and might disagree with you and might think journey times aren't a bad way of looking at the world. You know, they are common sense to look at them. That's why we're doing it. So, can we please proceed, Mr. Stevens? I don't know whether we can save time or not, but you will know that, let's test one out. If we go next to Mr. Axon's rebuttal at page 28, his rebuttal at page 28, we've got, do you see we've got routes B and C are marked on that figure there, routes B and C are marked. So B is Leyland Road and C is the A6. If we then look in his rebuttal, forgive me, there's some graphs at some figures at page 29 of the rebuttal, and the difference in journey times between the future year with and without our development is, well, there's either no or minute differences for route B, and it's expressed by and large in seconds for route C. Now, can you just help me? I know you don't like doing this, but let's just humour me for a moment. If we look just at those journey times in isolation for those routes, you're not saying those impacts are severe, or are you?
If you take route B, for example,
Yep.
can I refer you to my proof of evidence 4.1.84? Again, I'm highlighting vehicle speeds. This is a 30 miles an hour road,
Yeah.
where vehicle speeds are starting off at 11.8
Did I
and
ask
then
you about
reduced.
vehicle speeds? I asked you about the journey times. If you want
The
to
answer
talk
I'm going to be providing is exactly the same as the first corridor.
Right. So, in other words, for the journey times, they're not severe. The changes are not severe impacts. That's where we got to for the first one. But you think the difference in miles per hour is severe. Is that the answer?
As I've highlighted,
Gosh, why can't I have a straight answer to the question?
I'm
Journey times.
providing the clarity that I can based upon the information
No,
that's presented in front
no,
of me.
you're not. You know you're. Well, I don't know whether you do or you don't know what you're doing, Mr. Stevens. Forgive me, but it's certainly not helpful, I don't think. Journey times in isolation. Please don't tell me about vehicle speeds. I'm very happy to go to vehicle speeds next, but I'm asking you about journey times now. Journey times for these routes, as reported here. You're not saying in isolation these changes in journey times amount to a severe impact, or are you?
I have no concerns with route C, that is reasonably free flowing.
Right. Okay, well that's a start. So that leaves route B. Are the changes in journey times in isolation in your book a severe impact?
Having regard to that corridor, yes.
Right, okay, even though they are expressed in seconds.
Because I'm looking at my table, which then converts them to miles per hour.
Oh, for heaven's
Having
sake,
regard,
I'm gonna have to ask
having
for your help, so I'm
regard,
gonna have
having
to ask for your
regard
help. I'm
to
sorry. I'm sorry.
the length of the corridor.
I'm going to have to ask for the inspector's help here. Sorry. I mean, forgive me. I promised you I was going to look at vehicle speeds, but I'm asking about journey times first of all, because we have presented our work in journey times, and all I want is for the inspector to understand whether, when he looks at Mr. Axon's representation of journey times from the model, Mr. Axon's saying these changes are not severe. what's Mr. Stevens saying? That's all I'm trying to do. Why has it got to be so painful?
I don't know if I probably can't help, but I'm going to have a go. I understand Mr. Stevens' position from the various answers given to be that you can't tell. It's not a yes or a no, it's you can't tell. I know Mr. Katkowski doesn't want that answer, he wants a yes or a no, but I think it's not a binary. There's a third possibility, and it's I can't tell from just journey times. I think that's Mr. Stevens' position as I've tried to recall the evidence.
Well, that, with respect, can't be right, because you told me earlier on for the journey times for Route A that if we look at the journey times in isolation, the changes aren't severe. That's where we got to in the end. Sorry, I'm struggling here, as you can see, because I'm trying to ask about things step by step. And every time I ask about journey times, I'm told about vehicle speeds, even though I say we're going to look at vehicle speeds next. So can we just isolate journey times, Mr. Stevens, please?
I've tried to be very clear in all my responses. Looking at journey times in isolation does not indicate whether I've got the analysis I've done based upon the Vectos work. It breaks it down to give it a clear understanding what a journey time means. And you can't just indicate, is a journey time of 20 minutes, is that severe when compared to 19 minutes? It depends on what that journey length is. So, and therefore you convert that to vehicle speed. So time in isolation, I mean, fortunately for me, I've got the information that is available which converts the journey times to vehicle speed.
Yeah. Are we ever going to get an answer to my question? When the inspector comes to write his report, he's got material from Mr. Axon. Mr. Axon's work is on the basis of journey times. The inspector might or might not think that's a sensible approach. If the inspector considers it to be sensible, it might be useful for the inspector to know if there's any counterpoint to Mr. Axon's evidence. Mr. Axon's evidence being that increases in journey lengths of the lengths which are reported in this modelling are not very great, they're not severe. That's his position. It might be useful for the inspector to understand, well, is Mr. Stevens saying something else? And if he is, fine, we can then try to get to grips with it. So that's all. I'm just at that entry level question at the moment. We haven't really started. I mean, we're just trying to get our bearings. So are those increases in journey times, which in the main are in seconds, don't even get into minutes, are they severe, looked at in isolation or not?
As I said, I can't look at these purely without converting them into miles per hour.
Well, you can. You can.
I can convert them to miles per hour. You are correct.
No, you can look at them as journey speeds. Journey times, I'm going mad now. Journey times, you can look at them in journey times. Of course you can, because the information is reported here, and it's not a difficult question. Something would take you X minutes, and in the future with us it would take you X plus Y. Is that a severe change or not?
It would be helpful to have a yes or no answer.
I do respect that, but I think looking at a journey time in isolation, without all the other components to support it, you can't get a clear understanding of whether it is severe or not. I think, as I highlighted, if that journey corridor was double in length compared to half the length, and the journey times were still as they are, one could have twice, 4 times the impact. But just looking at it on a very simple perspective of journey times, whether you can say, well, actually, 10 minutes in isolation, just looking at that is acceptable, and 6 minutes isn't. You've got to look at the starting point. What is the starting point on that corridor? What are the vehicle speeds? And so looking at just journey time, and whilst I know that's part of the approach, and that's why I've always had a fundamental issue in looking at that in isolation, that's why it needs to be supported with other information. I've stuck to the point, and I'm happy with how I've answered the question.
So thank you for trying. So Mr. Stevens, is this where we get to then? Mr. Axon says here are the journey time changes. I, Mr. Axon, do not consider these to be impacts which would be severe, and you have no countervailing position in relation to that.
I think
in relation to journey times, because you say, I just don't accept that approach of looking at journey times.
Mr. Axon will be highlighting differences in vehicles in journey times is a good understanding to look at the net impact.
Yes.
But that is an approach which I can't support because you don't
No, we've
understand
got
what the
all of that.
clear impacts are.
Heaven's
So that's
sake,
why
Mr.
it's a
Stevens, we've
deficiency
got
in the
that.
approach that's being taken forward.
I couldn't give two hoots. That's not what I'm asking you about, Mr. Stevens. Forgive me. I thought, the inspector's been here as long as I have listening to all of this. I thought we'd got to a position where you said certain things were severe, then you changed it to no, not severe. And now you've got a position where looking at journey times on their own, you say you just can't do it. If that's your position, fine. The outcome of that is we've got Mr. Axon saying, here are changes of journey times from X to Y. I, Mr. Axon, don't think that's severe in impact terms. And in relation to journey times, we've got you saying nothing. Because you say you can't do it. Is that right?
I don't think you can get a meaningful answer just
Right.
looking at
Fine.
journey times in isolation.
Okay, and so I'm sorry, but I'm going to persist. That means, therefore, that whereas Mr. Axon is saying on journey times these changes are not severe, you are not saying the opposite. You're not agreeing with him or disagreeing with him. You have no position on the journey times.
On the journey times, I think the approach is flawed.
Oh, Mr. Stevens.
It's got to be flawed.
Mr.
Because
Stevens,
it's got to be. No,
Mr. Stevens, sorry. Can you for once listen to my question? Because I'm really going to lose my temper in a moment. Forgive me. And I'm a very measured, calm person, but you're really winding me up. So just listen. Mr. Axon says, here are changes in journey times. Those impacts are not severe. You're saying, as I understand it, is this fair, that those changes in journey times, you can neither say they're severe nor not severe. You haven't got a position at all in relation to whether those changes are severe or not severe. No position at all. Is that fair? That's the question.
I can consider them severe based upon all the other attributes.
No, now we're going round in circles.
I'm making the same point again and again and again. Yes, I am.
No, you're not, because you've told us several times over that in isolation journey times, I'd thought, and even my own friend understood your answers this way, that looked at an isolation, you can't make a judgment as to whether the impacts would be severe. So I'm just playing that back to you. Mr. Axon says you can, and the impacts are not severe. If you, Mr. Stevens, say you can't look at them in isolation, therefore, you haven't got a position as to whether those changes in journey times would be severe or not severe. That's a logical consequence, Mr. Stevens. Don't you see that?
I can hear what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm right, aren't I? You haven't got a position on whether the changes in journey times looked at in isolation would be severe or not severe.
I don't think it's possible to be able to make that decision.
So therefore you haven't got a position as to whether they would be severe or not severe.
It would be unreasonable for me to say they are severe because I wouldn't be able to back that up because you can't look at journey times in isolation.
Okay, that's as close as I'm going to get, I think, to an answer. And would that be the same, just to save us time and to save me, if I had any hair, losing the rest of it, would that be the same answer, forgive me, in relation to all of the other routes which have been tested and reported? You'll know, I was going to call him Mr. Stevens, you know Mr. Axon in his proof and rebuttal has presented some of the routes. Mm-hmm. All of them are presented in the TA. Mm-hmm. So if I was to ask you the same set of questions about all the other routes and all the other journey times which were reported, would I get a the same answer from you?
Yes, you would.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Well, that saved a bit of time there, then thank you. Good. Let us move on. What I'm going to do next, please, is I wanted to look at your standalone junction modelling. I note the time, and so this isn't something that's going to be done in 11 minutes. So if we were to stop somewhere logical, it would be here.
Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And I should go and take my medication so I can calm down. Ready for tomorrow.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. In which case we will bring proceedings to an end for today. Just a procedural point. My computer crashed again then, so tomorrow morning I'm wondering whether I might bring the core documents from the back of the room up here
Right.
so that I have access to a set should I
So
lose access to
indeed,
the computer.
No problem at all. So just, I don't know whether someone can even find it in the box, but if you bear with me for 1 minute, I think the only document outside Mr. Stevens' proofs, etc., that you've got. Oh, wait a minute. Are you using his? Were you going to be using his appendices?
His appendices are all on here as well.
Okay,
So
cool. You will
yep,
need
I'll-
the
yep.
appendices for Mr. Stevens, the appendices for Mr. Axon,
Yep.
proof
Mhm.
and rebuttal.
Yep.
You'll certainly need the TA.
TA. Yep.
I'm not sure we're going to be straying beyond that, to be honest.
Okay.
But,
Right.
if you were to dig around
Yep.
and root
Okay.
around in the box.
Will do. Yep. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. That's good. Right. Any other procedural points then before we come back
No, sir.
tomorrow? No. Okay. Well, it's 10 to 5. We'll adjourn and resume at 9:30 in the morning. Just confirming that we're able to get access tomorrow. Yes.
There's a
Excellent.
shame.
Good. 9:30 it is then.
Keep the door shut till 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Neil, you're incommunicado.
Oh. Yes.